Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever felt like you're being watched while waiting for something that never comes? I stood alone in the center of Elderbrook Station, my footsteps echoing across the vast marble floor. The grand old railway terminal, once the pride of the city, now stood nearly abandoned after decades of neglect. As a historical photographer, I was drawn to places like this, where time seemed frozen, where stories lingered in the dust. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I'd convinced the property management to let me photograph the station before its scheduled demolition next month. Just a few hours, they'd said. Be out by sunset. I checked my watch, 4:30 in the afternoon. Plenty of time. The station's waiting hall was a cathedral of transit, high vaulted ceilings, ornate columns, and long wooden benches arranged in perfect rows. Dust motes danced in the shafts of fading sunlight that streamed through the tall, arched windows. My camera clicked rhythmically as I captured the faded grandeur. Something about the quality of light bothered me, though. It seemed to bend wrong around the benches, casting shadows that stretched a little too long, a little too dark. Twice now, I turned quickly, certain I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Just the wind, I muttered, though the air was still. I approached the old ticket counter, its brass fixtures tarnished green with age. Behind the counter, dozens of small cubbyholes once held tickets to destinations across the country. Many still contained faded papers. I leaned over to examine one. Westbridge. One way. June 17th, 1954. A cold draft suddenly brushed against my neck. I spun around, but the hall remained empty. Yet, something had changed. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then I realized the quality of light had shifted. The golden afternoon glow had faded to a sickly blue-gray, though my watch showed it was still only 4:45. I raised my camera again, focusing on the central information board that still displayed destinations and times frozen decades ago. Through my viewfinder, I noticed something odd, a smudge on one of the benches that hadn't been there before. Lowering my camera, I walked closer. It wasn't a smudge. It was a hat. A fedora, to be precise, the kind men wore in the 50s. I was certain it hadn't been there moments before. I reached out to touch it, but stopped as the temperature in the room suddenly plummeted. My breath clouded in front of me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the cavernous space. "Is someone here?" No response, but as I turned back toward the ticket counter, I could have sworn I heard the faintest sound of rustling fabric, like someone shifting on one of the wooden benches behind me. The ticket windows, previously empty, now contained a reflection that made my blood run cold. Behind me, where there should have been nothing but empty benches, the glass reflected the silhouette of a person sitting perfectly still. I whirled around. The bench was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs as I backed toward the exit. It was time to leave, story or no story. But as I reached the grand archway leading to the main doors, I noticed something even more disturbing. The doors I'd entered through, the only entrance to the station, were gone, replaced by a solid brick wall that looked as though it had been there for centuries. This is impossible, I thought, touching the rough surface of the bricks. This isn't real. From somewhere deeper in the station came the mournful sound of a train whistle, though no trains had run through Elderbrook for over 30 years. And behind me, the unmistakable sound of someone clearing their throat. I refused to turn around immediately. My fingers traced the outline of bricks where the exit should have been, searching desperately for some logical explanation. The mortar felt ancient between my fingers, crumbling slightly to the touch. How could doors disappear and be replaced by a wall that looked centuries old? This is a hallucination, I whispered to myself. Stress. Exhaustion. Maybe carbon monoxide. The throat-clearing sound came again, more insistent this time. Reluctantly, I turned. A man sat on the bench nearest to me, though I was certain that bench had been empty moments before. He wore a charcoal gray suit with narrow lapels and clutched a brown leather briefcase on his lap. His face was turned away from me, staring at the information board. "Excuse me," I called, my voice cracking. The doors seemed to be blocked. "Do you know another way out?" The man didn't respond or acknowledge me. As I took a hesitant step toward him, I noticed something unsettling. His edges seemed blurred, as if he were photographed slightly out of focus. And though he was only about 20 feet away, I couldn't make out the details of his face. "Hello?" I tried again. Still nothing. But now, as my eyes adjusted to the increasingly dim light, I noticed other figures materializing throughout the waiting hall. A woman in a floral dress at the far end, standing rigidly beside a column. An elderly man with a cane near the ticket counter. A young boy swinging his legs from a bench too high for his feet to touch the ground. None of them moved naturally. They were like freeze frames, occasionally shifting position when I wasn't looking directly at them. And none acknowledged my presence. My camera suddenly felt heavy around my neck. I raised it, more out of professional habit than conscious decision, and peered through the viewfinder. Through the lens, the waiting hall transformed. The figures multiplied, dozens, then hundreds of people filled the benches, all frozen in various poses of waiting. Men checked pocket watches, women clutched handbags, children stood unnaturally still beside parents. But most disturbing of all, through the camera, I could see their faces. They had no eyes. Where I should have been, there were only dark, empty sockets, yet they all seemed to be staring directly at me. I dropped the camera, letting it hang from its strap, and the hall returned to its previous state, just a handful of blurry figures scattered throughout. But now I noticed something else. The architectural details of the station were changing. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly. The marble floor beneath my feet had developed fine cracks that spread like spider webs. The temperature continued to drop. My fingers felt numb, and each breath produced a thicker cloud in front of my face. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional sound of paper rustling or a muffled cough. I decided to try another approach. Perhaps there was a service exit, a back door I hadn't noticed. I began walking toward a corridor that led off from the main waiting hall, trying to appear calm though my heart raced. As I moved, I realized with horror that the figures were tracking me with their featureless faces. Though they didn't turn their heads, I could feel their attention shifting with me. The corridor ahead seemed to stretch as I approached it, growing longer with each step I took. The lights overhead flickered, plunging the passage into darkness for brief, terrifying seconds before weakly illuminating again. From somewhere ahead came the sound of a public address system crackling to life. A voice, distorted and barely comprehensible, began to announce departures. Track 13, westbound, passengers with tickets, now boarding. The announcement made no sense. This station had only 8 tracks, according to the historical plans I'd studied. I stopped walking when I noticed dark liquid seeping from beneath the door marked Station Master. It pooled on the floor, reflecting the flickering lights above. I told myself it was water from a broken pipe, but it was too thick, too dark. As I stood frozen in place, the scattered figures in the waiting hall began to move in unison. Slowly, jerkily, they all rose from their seated positions and turned toward the corridor where I stood. And then, as one, they began walking toward me. My legs finally obeyed the frantic commands from my brain: run, hide, escape, and I bolted down the corridor, away from the approaching figures. The dark liquid splashed beneath my feet, staining my shoes with what looked disturbingly like rust-colored mud. The smell hit me then, a musty combination of wet earth and something metallic that clung to the back of my throat. The corridor twisted in ways that defied the building's architecture. I'd studied the station's blueprints thoroughly before my visit, but nothing matched what I was experiencing now. Doorways appeared and disappeared along the walls as I ran, some opening briefly to reveal glimpses of impossible spaces, a forest of dead trees, an ocean churning beneath a moonless sky, a field of withered gravestones. My lungs burned as I ran, the frigid air cutting into my chest with each desperate breath. Behind me, I could hear the steady shuffle of dozens of feet, maintaining a consistent pace, unhurried yet relentless. "They don't need to hurry," a voice in my head whispered. "They have all the time in the world." I rounded a corner and found myself in what appeared to be the station's former restaurant. Tables with white cloths stood in perfect rows, place settings meticulously arranged for diners who would never arrive. A layer of dust covered everything, except for one table in the center where 2 wine glasses stood, one lipstick stained, both half full with dark liquid. Condensation beat on the glasses. They'd been poured recently. I ducked behind the restaurant's bar, pressing myself against the sticky floor. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. The screen showed 7:15, impossible, since I'd arrived at 4 and couldn't have been here more than an hour. Even stranger, the date displayed was June 17th. The same date as on the ticket I'd examined earlier. A chair scraped against the floor somewhere in the dining room. Then another. And another. The sounds of people taking seats, unfolding napkins, glasses clinking. I peered over the bar's edge. The restaurant had filled with diners, or rather, the same blurry, featureless figures from the waiting hall, now pantomiming the act of eating meals that weren't there. Their movements were disjointed, mechanical. Some raised empty forks to invisible mouths, others tilted their heads to sip from empty cups. Among them, moving between the tables, was a new figure, more solid than the others. A waiter in a crisp uniform, his back to me as he leaned down to whisper something to a seated patron. When he straightened and turned, I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. Where his face should have been was a black void, a darkness deeper than mere absence of light. It seemed to pull at my vision, creating a nauseating sense of falling while I looked directly at it. Yet 2 points of blue light flickered within that void, like distant stars. The waiter's head tilted, those pinpricks of light fixing on me. His body moved jerkily as he began walking toward the bar, a weathered leather-bound book clutched in his hands. "And no," I stammered, backing away. "I don't want anything." He continued forward, extending the book toward me. It fell open, pages flipping rapidly as if caught in a violent wind, though the air was still. When the pages settled, I saw it was not a menu but a ledger, filled with names and dates written in faded ink. The last entry was incomplete, a blank line waiting to be filled. The waiter produced a fountain pen from his pocket and offered it to me, those twin lights in his void face growing brighter, more insistent. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely audible. From the nearest table, a woman's voice responded, though her blur face never moved. "Sign it. Join us. Your train will come soon." The waiter's arm stretched unnaturally long, the pen now inches from my face. Behind him, all the diners had stopped their pretend meal and turned toward me, waiting. "I don't have a ticket," I said, the words tumbling out before I could think them through. A sound filled the room then, dozens of people inhaling sharply in unison. The temperature plummeted further, frost crystallizing on the bar top beside me. "No ticket?" The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Then you shouldn't be here at all." The diners rose from their tables as one, their forms stretching and distorting, elongating toward the ceiling. The waiter's face void expanded, those twin lights stretching into horizontal slits. I turned and ran, bursting through swinging kitchen doors, only to find myself not in a kitchen but back in the main waiting hall, though it had transformed yet again. The grand space was now filled with dense fog that swirled around my ankles, and the ceiling had vanished, replaced by a night sky where no stars shone. And on every bench, hundreds of figures sat watching me, their heads turning in unison to track my movement. A train whistle pierced the silence, much closer now, accompanied by the rumble of approaching wheels on tracks. The train whistle tore through the fog, its pitch climbing to an unbearable screech that forced me to cover my ears. The sound resonated within my skull, vibrating through my teeth and bones. The rumbling grew stronger, the marble floor beneath my feet trembling as if something massive approached. "Where are the tracks?" I gasped, spinning in confusion. The station's platform should have been through another set of doors, not in the waiting hall itself. The fog parted before me, revealing gleaming rails that had impossibly manifested directly through the center of the hall, cutting through marble floor and wooden benches alike. The rails pulsed with a faint blue luminescence, humming with energy. All around me, the waiting figures rose in perfect synchronization. Their movements became more fluid now, more purposeful, as they gathered their phantom belongings and lined up along the tracks. The air grew heavy with anticipation, a collected intake of breath from hundreds of spectral passengers. The rumbling intensified, and a wind picked up, swirling the fog into ghostly shapes. Through the mist, I could make out the silhouette of an approaching train, but something was wrong with its proportions. It was too tall, too narrow, its windows elongated like screaming mouths. A mechanical screech of brakes filled the hall as the phantom train slowed to a stop. No conductor called out destinations. No doors visibly opened. Yet the figures began to board, disappearing one by one into the mist that obscured the train's middle section. "What is happening?" I whispered, though I knew no one would answer. But someone did. A hand gripped my shoulder from behind, solid, cold, undeniably real. I yelped and spun around to face an elderly man in a conductor's uniform. Unlike the other figures, he was perfectly detailed, from the weathered creases around his eyes to the tarnished buttons on his jacket. Only the unnatural paleness of his skin and the absolute stillness of his chest suggested he wasn't alive. "You're not supposed to be here, son," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "This train isn't for you." "I want to leave," I pleaded. "The doors disappeared, and I can't find my way out." He studied me with milky blue eyes. "You came to document our waiting hall, didn't you? To preserve our memory before they tear it all down." I nodded nervously, clutching my camera. "We've been waiting a long time," he continued. "Some for decades. Our train was delayed, you see. Indefinitely delayed." He gave a sad smile. "When they closed the station, We had nowhere else to go. No other train would take us to our destinations. What destinations? I asked, unable to stop myself. The conductor gestured toward the phantom train. Beyond. The next place. But we missed our connections, and so we wait. Every night, the train comes, but it's never the right one. Never the one that will take us where we need to go. Around us, the last of the figures were boarding the misty train. I noticed with horror that some were being pulled in against their will, their forms stretching and distorting as they were absorbed into the fog. They forget, after a while, the conductor explained, noting my expression. Forget they're waiting for a specific train. They just board anything that arrives, hoping it'll take them somewhere, anywhere else. But it just brings them back here, night after night. The train whistle blew again, signaling its imminent departure. You need to go now, the conductor said urgently, pressing something into my hand. Before it notices you don't belong. I looked down. He'd given me a ticket, yellowed with age. Elderbrook to Westbridge. One way. June 17th, 1954. I don't understand, I said. Exit through the service door behind the information booth. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. His eyes darted toward the train. It's hungry tonight. As if responding to his words, the train let out another whistle, but this sound was different, more like the wail of a predator than any mechanical noise. The fog surrounding it darkened, tendrils extending toward us. Run, the conductor hissed, pushing me away. It's seen you. I turned and sprinted toward the information booth, the ticket clutched in my fist. Behind me, I heard the conductor call out, "Next time, buy a ticket before you board." The fog surged after me, faster than I could run, wrapping around my ankles. It burned like dry ice against my skin. I cried out, struggling forward as the mist thickened around me. Ahead, barely visible through the swirling gray, I spotted a small door-marked staff only behind the information booth. It seemed to waver and distort, sometimes appearing yards away, sometimes directly in front of me. The tendrils of fog wrapped around my waist now, tugging me backward. The air filled with whispers, hundreds of voices offering destinations, connections, transfers to places that couldn't possibly exist. With a final desperate lunge, I reached for the door handle, my fingers brushing the cold metal as the fog tightened around my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was the conductor standing beside the phantom train, sadly shaking his head as the fog pulled me backward toward the waiting maw of the impossible locomotive. I woke to the sensation of hardwood beneath me and bright sunlight on my face. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, afraid to open my eyes. The warmth of the sun seemed wrong after the bone-deep cold I'd experienced. Sir, are you all right? I cracked one eye open. A security guard stood over me, concern etched on his face. I was lying on one of the benches in the waiting hall, my camera resting on my chest, early morning light streaming through the windows. The station's not open to the public, the guard continued. How'd you get in here? I sat up slowly, my body aching as if I'd run a marathon. I had permission. 4 photographs. Yesterday afternoon. The guard frowned. You've been here all night? What time is it? 7:30 in the morning. Wednesday. I checked my phone. June 18th. I'd lost an entire night. Must have fallen asleep, I muttered, but I knew it wasn't true. The events of the night felt too real, too visceral to have been a dream. The guard helped me gather my things, clearly eager to escort me out. The waiting hall looked exactly as it had when I first arrived, dusty, abandoned, sun-faded. No fog, no train tracks cutting through the floor, no blurry figures sitting on benches. They're really tearing this place down next month? I asked as we walked toward the exit, the perfectly normal, existing exit with its massive wooden doors standing open to the street beyond. Yeah. Shame, really. Beautiful old building. The guard glanced around. Lots of history here. At the threshold, I paused and looked back. For just a moment, in the furthest corner of the hall, I thought I saw the conductor standing beside a column, watching me. But when I blinked, there was nothing there. Outside, the morning city bustled around me. Cars honked, people hurried to work, the smell of a nearby coffee shop filled the air. Everything normal. Everything real. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with warm summer air. My hand brushed against something in my pocket. I reached in and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. Elderbrook to Westbridge. One way. June 17th, 1954. My blood ran cold. I turned back toward the station, but the security guard had already closed the doors behind me. That night, in my apartment, I connected my camera to my computer to download the photographs. Most were what I expected, shots of the empty waiting hall, the ticket counter, architectural details of the once grand station. But the last few images made my heart stop. The waiting hall filled with blurry figures. The impossible train tracks cutting through the marble floor. And clearest of all, the conductor, standing directly in front of my camera, his face in perfect focus while everything around him blurred. His eyes stared directly into the lens, his expression somewhere between warning and invitation. Behind him, barely visible in the fog, hundreds of faceless passengers stood in line, waiting to board a train that would never take them where they needed to go. I deleted the photos immediately. Then I deleted the backups. Then I reformatted the memory card. But it was too late. 3 nights later, I woke at exactly 3:17 in the morning to the sound of a train whistle outside my bedroom window. Impossible, since I lived miles from any tracks. The sound of my phone buzzing drew my attention. A text message from an unknown number. Your train departs tonight. Elderbrook Station. Platform 13. Don't be late. We saved you a seat. I've moved twice since then. Changed my phone number. Even changed jobs. But the messages still find me. And each night, I dream of the waiting hall, of the passengers with their blurry faces, of the conductor holding out his hand for my ticket. Sometimes I see the waiting hall patrons during the day now, standing motionless at bus stops, sitting alone in coffee shops, always watching me, always waiting. I know what they want. The ticket sits in my bedside drawer, impossible to destroy. I've burned it, shredded it, even dissolved it in acid once. But every morning it reappears, the paper a little more yellowed, the ink a little more faded. Elderbrook to Westbridge. One way. June 17th, 1954. The demolition of the station was mysteriously postponed, then canceled altogether. Historical preservation, they said. Cultural significance. But I know the truth. The waiting hall wouldn't let itself be destroyed. It has too many passengers still waiting. And now, it's waiting for me too. Tonight, I think I might go. Take my seat on that impossible train. Because waiting, knowing it's coming for me eventually, that's become the real horror. better to board willingly than to be dragged aboard. If you find yourself in Elderbrook Station after dark, buy a ticket before you enter the waiting hall. Any ticket will do. Just make sure you have one. And whatever you do, don't make eye contact with the other passengers. They've been waiting a very long time, and they're looking for someone to take their place. Someone like me. Someone like you. Can you hear it? That faint melody that seems to drift through the walls when the world grows quiet? The abandoned concert hall loomed before me, its once grand facade now crumbling under decades of neglect. Gothic architecture twisted toward the night sky, blackened windows staring like empty eye sockets into the darkness. I clutched the crumpled flyer in my hand, reading the words once more, Midnight Symphony, one night only, December 10th. My name is Thomas Reed, a music critic for the local newspaper. Attending unusual performances was part of my job, but something about this invitation felt different. No performer was listed. No ticket price. Just an address and a time, midnight. The massive oak doors creaked as I pushed them open, releasing the stale breath of a building long forgotten. My footsteps echoed across the marble floor, each sound reverberating through the empty lobby. Dust particles danced in the beam of my flashlight, swirling like miniature galaxies being born and dying in seconds. Hello? I called out, my voice seeming smaller than it should have. The silence that answered felt deliberate, as if something was deliberately holding its breath. I made my way toward the main hall, my hand trailing along the wall for guidance. The velvet wallpaper, once rich and vibrant, now hung in tatters, revealing the skeletal framework of the building beneath. The air grew colder with each step, though I couldn't feel any draft. A whisper brushed past my ear, so faint I nearly convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then it came again, a soft murmuring that sounded almost like my name. Is anyone there? I called, spinning around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing. Just more empty hallways stretching behind me. When I turned back, I noticed something odd, a faint glow emanating from beneath the doors leading to the main concert hall. Warm yellow light, like candlelight, pulsed gently, inviting me forward. My watch read 11:58. I hesitated, my hand resting on the brass door handle. A sense of rawness crawled across my skin, raising goosebumps along my arms. The rational part of my mind urged me to leave, to return in daylight with company. But curiosity, my greatest virtue and most dangerous flaw, pushed me forward. As I opened the door, the first notes reached me. A single violin, playing a melody so melancholy it seemed to pull at something deep within my chest. The concert hall was vast, with rows of dusty velvet seats facing a stage illuminated by dozens of candles. Their flickering light cast monstrous, dancing shadows across the walls and ceiling. But the stage was empty. The music continued, growing in complexity as if more instruments were joining an invisible orchestra. I could hear the distinct sound of a cello, then a piano, though neither instrument was visible. I moved down the center aisle, drawn toward the Phantom Symphony. The temperature dropped with each step, my breath now visible in front of me. In the third row, center, I found a single program resting on a seat. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The paper felt damp, almost organic, beneath my touch. It read simply, "Tonight's performance, Requiem for the Forgotten." The candles flickered as one, their light dimming momentarily, and when they brightened again, I saw them, transparent figures seated throughout the hall, their forms shimmering like heat mirages on a summer road. Some wore clothing from centuries past, others in more modern attire, but all sat motionless, facing the empty stage. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly lowered myself into the seat, the program still clutched in my hand. I told myself I was imagining things, that the strange shadows were tricks of candlelight and my overtired mind. But then the music changed, shifting to a tempo that matched my racing heartbeat exactly. A woman's voice joined the instruments, a soprano so pure it could only exist in the realm between life and death. And somehow, I knew with absolute certainty that the concert wasn't beginning at midnight. It had been playing continuously for decades, perhaps centuries. And I wasn't in the audience. I was part of the performance. The music swelled around me, growing more complex with each passing moment. What had begun as a simple, haunting melody now expanded into something rich and terrible. I could distinguish individual instruments, violins weeping, cellos groaning, brass instruments wailing like tortured souls, yet the stage remained empty. I gripped the armrests of my seat, my knuckles white with tension. The phantom audience sat motionless around me, their translucent forms flickering like candle flames in a draft. Their faces were turned toward the stage, expressions frozen in various states of rapture and horror. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, but my words were immediately swallowed by a thunderous crescendo that shook dust from the ornate ceiling. I noticed something disturbing about the theater now. The exits that had been clearly visible when I entered seemed to have receded, as if the room itself was stretching. The walls appeared to pulse subtly, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the music, like the chamber of some great heart. The air grew thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and organic that reminded me of blood. Each breath felt heavier, as if I were drowning on dry land. A movement caught my eye. One of the ghost-like spectators had turned to look at me. An elderly man in Victorian clothing, his eyes sunk in dark pits in his translucent face. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the music, but I could read his lips clearly. "You shouldn't have come." Cold panic flooded my veins. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the music itself had wound around my limbs, binding me to the seat. The symphony shifted again, incorporating sounds that no conventional instrument could make, the rattling of countless bones, the susurration of final breaths, the scraping of nails against wood. Between these terrible sounds, I began to distinguish words, woven into the music like a subliminal message. "Join us. Stay with us. Play with us." My inner voice, the rational music critic, desperately tried to analyze what was happening. Perhaps this was an elaborate performance art piece with hidden speakers and holographic projections. Maybe someone had slipped something into my drink earlier that evening. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. The ghost beside me leaned closer, his form passing partially through the armrest between us. "Every midnight," he whispered, his voice somehow audible beneath the music, "we play. We must play. The conductor demands it." "Who is the conductor?" I managed to ask, my voice thin with fear. The ghost's expression twisted into something between pity and terror. "Look," he said, pointing a translucent finger toward the orchestra pit. I leaned forward, peering into the darkness below the stage. At first, I saw nothing. Then, as if responding to my attention, a single candle ignited in the pit, illuminating what stood there. My mind recoiled from what I saw. Where a human conductor should have stood was a figure of impossible proportions. Its limbs were too long, too jointed, moving with a fluidity that defied anatomy. Instead of formal attire, it wore what appeared to be flayed skin, stitched together in a grotesque patchwork. Its back was to me, but as the music reached another crescendo, it began to turn. "Don't look at its face," the ghost beside me hissed urgently. "Never look at its face." I jerked my gaze away just as the figure completed its turn, focusing instead on its hands. Elongated fingers gripped a conductor's baton that appeared to be made of bone. As it moved, the phantom orchestra responded, music rising and falling in perfect obedience. "What happens at the end of the concert?" I asked, still avoiding looking directly at the conductor. The ghost's laugh was hollow, echoing inside my skull rather than through my ears. "The concert never ends, Mr. Reed. But the orchestra must be maintained." A chill ran through me at the use of my name, which I hadn't shared with anyone here. "How do you know who I am?" "Your invitation wasn't random. None of ours were. The conductor chooses those with a deep connection to music, critics, composers, performers. Those who understand the power of sound. Those whose souls will enrich the symphony." I noticed now that some of the transparent figures held instruments, a violinist with fingers worn to bone, a flutist whose cheeks had collapsed inward from centuries of playing, a pianist whose hands seemed to melt into the keys of an invisible instrument. "I don't understand," I said, though the terrible truth was beginning to dawn on me. "The conductor needs new players," the ghost explained. "Old souls eventually fade, their music depleted. Fresh talent is required." As if on cue, the music changed again, becoming softer, more seductive. A spotlight appeared, illuminating an empty chair on stage with a cello propped beside it. My cello. The one I had played in my youth, before choosing the safer path of criticism over performance. "How is that possible?" I whispered. "That instrument was destroyed in a fire 20 years ago." "Time and space mean nothing to the conductor," the ghost replied. "It knows what calls to your soul." The spotlight brightened, and the music seemed to beckon me forward. I felt my body begin to rise without my consent, my legs carrying me toward the aisle. "No, this isn't happening," I thought desperately. "This can't be real." But my protests did nothing to stop my steady progress toward the stage. The phantom audience watched impassively as I climbed the steps, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of pity and relief. One soul departing meant another would take its place. As I approached the cello, I could see the familiar scratch on its neck, the worn spot on the fingerboard where my hand had rested for countless hours of practice. This was undeniably my instrument. I stood before it, trembling, as the conductor raised its baton once more. Behind me, the concert hall doors slammed shut with finality, and I knew the real performance was only beginning. My fingers touched the cello's smooth wooden surface, and a jolt of recognition shot through me. Memories flooded back, hours spent practicing in my childhood bedroom, the pride in my mother's eyes at my first recital, the devastation when the fire claimed both my instrument and my parents, leaving me alone at 18. I hadn't touched a cello since then. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure to whom I was pleading. "I can't do this anymore." The conductor's baton remained poised in the air, waiting. The phantom audience watched in expectant silence. In that moment, the music had paused, creating a vacuum of sound so profound my ears ached with it. Something stirred within me, rebellion. I had come here as a critic, an observer, not a participant. I turned away from the cello, facing the audience. "I'm leaving," I announced, my voice echoing through the hall. Shocked murmurs rippled through the spectral audience. The Victorian gentleman who had spoken to me earlier shook his head in mourning. The temperature in the hall plummeted instantly. My breath crystallized before my eyes, and frost began to form on the cello's strings. The candles surrounding the stage flared unnaturally high, their flames turning from gold to ice blue. Behind me, I felt movement. Slow, deliberate footsteps ascending the stage steps. The conductor was coming. Panic seized me. I looked desperately for an exit, but the wings of the stage were cloaked in impenetrable darkness. The only way out was through the audience, past whatever was approaching from behind. I made my decision in an instant, bolting across the stage toward the opposite steps. As I ran, the wooden boards beneath my feet began to warp and twist, creating obstacles that hadn't been there seconds before. I stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to keep my balance. The music erupted again, no longer a symphony but a cacophony of discordant notes and tortured sounds. It was the auditory equivalent of a scream, pressing against my eardrums until I feared they would rupture. I reached the steps and took them two at a time, plunging into the audience. To my horror, the ghostly spectators began to rise from their seats, reaching for me with translucent hands that felt like ice where they passed through my skin. "You can't leave," they moaned in unison. "No one leaves." I pushed through them, their forms dissipating like smoke only to reform in my path. The exit doors seemed impossibly distant, the aisle stretching longer with each desperate step I took. A sound cut through the chaos, the first notes of a familiar piece. Bach's Cello Suite No. 1, the first serious piece I had mastered as a young musician. It was being played with perfect technique but terrible mechanical precision, as if by someone who knew the notes but not the soul of the music. Despite my terror, I found myself turning to look back at the stage. The conductor stood beside my cello, which was now playing itself, the bow moving across the strings without human guidance. I still couldn't see its face. Shadows seemed to cling to it no matter how brightly the candles burned, but I could feel its attention focused entirely on me. It raised a hand, and the ghostly audience froze in place. The only sound was the cello, playing my piece, playing my past. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. The music changed, incorporating a second voice that harmonized with the cello. I recognized this as well. It was a duet I had composed at 16, a piece that had never been performed because my mother had fallen ill before the scheduled recital. No one else could possibly know this music. It had existed only in my mind and in a notebook that had been destroyed along with everything else I owned in the fire. The conductor's hand beckoned me back toward the stage. I stood frozen in the aisle, torn between flight and fascination. The music of my youth, the composition I had poured my heart into, was finally being performed, and with a skill that surpassed what I had imagined possible. "How are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The Victorian gentleman appeared beside me, his form more substantial than before. "The conductor sees into your soul, Mr. Reed. It knows every note you've ever written, played, or even imagined. That's why you were chosen." "Chosen for what?" "To join the Eternal Orchestra. To have your music preserved forever." He gestured toward the phantom musicians. "We were all like you once. Passionate, talented, unfulfilled." I looked at the ghostly players with new eyes, noticing details I had missed before. A young woman with a violin bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor Wilson, a prodigy who had vanished mysteriously in 1973. An older man at the piano had the unmistakable profile of Jeremiah Brooks, a composer whose promising career had ended when he disappeared just before his major debut in 1932. "All of you," I whispered. "The lost musicians. The ones who vanished without explanation." The Victorian gentleman nodded solemnly. "The world forgets. The conductor remembers." On stage, my cello waited, its strings vibrating with anticipation. The duet continued, but now there were gaps in the composition, spaces where a third voice should join. my voice, my playing. I felt a pull toward the instrument, not physical but spiritual, as if part of my soul was already seated there, waiting for the rest to follow. If I play, I asked, what happens to me? You become part of something eternal, the gentleman replied. Your music will never die. But I will. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. I closed my eyes, thinking of the years since the fire. I had abandoned my own musical career, choosing instead to critique others, to live adjacent to the passion I had once embraced. I had been afraid of feeling that depth of emotion again, afraid of the loss that had accompanied it. The conductor's baton tapped against a music stand, calling for attention. When I opened my eyes, the ghostly audience had returned to their seats. The hall was arranged exactly as it had been when I first entered, except for one detail. The exit doors had vanished completely, replaced by a smooth wall. There was no way out now. Only forward, toward the stage, toward my cello, toward a decision that would determine whether I would become the latest musician to mysteriously disappear without a trace. Time seemed to suspend itself as I stood at the crossroads of decision. The cello on stage gleamed in the candlelight, its wooden body reflecting flames that danced like spirits trying to escape. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but where? The doors had vanished. The only path remaining led to the stage. The conductor remained motionless, baton raised, waiting. The phantom orchestra sat with instruments poised, dozens of empty eyes fixed on me. I took one step toward the stage, then another. It felt as though I were moving through water, each motion requiring extraordinary effort. The music had softened to a gentle, coaxing melody, like a lullaby designed to lower my defenses. You don't have to do this, I whispered to myself, but even as the words left my lips, I knew they were false. There was no choice anymore. Perhaps there never had been. I ascended the steps once more, my footfalls echoing like drum beats in the silent hall. As I approached the cello, memories continued to flood back, not just of playing, but of the joy music had once brought me. The pure connection I had felt to something greater than myself when I drew the bow across the strings. When had I lost that? When had criticism replaced creation? I sat on the chair, my body remembering the posture without conscious thought. My hands reached for the instrument, and it felt like greeting an old friend. The wood was warm against my palm, as if it had been waiting for me. The conductor turned slightly, and though I still couldn't see its face, I felt its attention, a pressure against my skin like standing too close to a fire. I positioned the cello between my knees and lifted the bow. For a moment, I hesitated, overwhelmed by how unnatural it felt after 20 years of absence. The conductor's baton moved, and the orchestra began to play. The piece was unfamiliar at first, dark, complex, with an underlying rhythm that mimicked a heartbeat. Then, with a shock of recognition, I realized it was a twisted variation of the duet I had composed as a teenager. But where my original piece had been filled with hope and longing, this version spoke of loss and sacrifice. My entrance approached. I could feel it in the building tension of the music. The conductor's baton pointed directly at me, and without conscious decision, I began to play. The first note sang out, pure and true, filling the concert hall with a sound so perfect it brought tears to my eyes. My fingers found the fingerboard as if they had never left it, moving with a precision and skill that surpassed what I had possessed even at the height of my training. As I played, something strange began to happen. The boundaries between myself and the music started to blur. I could feel each note resonating not just through the cello's body but through my own. My heartbeat synchronized with the tempo, my breathing fell into rhythm with the phrases. The phantom audience leaned forward in their seats, their forms becoming more solid, more present with each measure I completed. Simultaneously, I had the unsettling sensation that I was becoming less substantial, as if the music was drawing something essential from me with each stroke of the bow. I tried to stop playing, to lift the bow from the strings, but my hands no longer obeyed my commands. They belonged to the music now, to the conductor. Terror coursed through me, but even that emotion was immediately translated into my playing, adding a frantic quality to the melody that the conductor acknowledged with an appreciative tilt of its head. "Please," I gasped between phrases. "I don't want this." The Victorian gentleman materialized beside the stage, more solid than I had yet seen him. "It's too late, Mr. Reed. The performance has begun." I looked down at my hands in horror as they continued to play. The skin around my fingertips had begun to take on a translucent quality, the bones beneath becoming visible as they moved across the strings. I was becoming like them. The music accelerated, demanding more of me. My fingers moved with impossible speed, playing passages I could never have managed in my former life. Pain shot through my hands as the strings cut into my fingertips, but no blood appeared, only a luminous, misty substance that was absorbed immediately into the cello's wood. The instrument grew warmer against my body, almost hot, as if it were feeding on what it extracted from me. I could feel my strength draining with each measure, my life force being converted into pure sound. And yet, there was ecstasy in the agony. Each note I produced was perfect, each phrase exactly as I had always imagined music could be but had never achieved. I was playing better than any human possibly could, and the knowledge was intoxicating even as it destroyed me. The conductor's movements became more expansive, more demanding. The phantom orchestra played with renewed vigor, their forms solidifying as mine deteriorated. I realized with dawning horror what was happening. My life essence was being distributed among them, renewing their spectral existence while depleting my own. The cello between my legs began to change, its wood becoming translucent like smoky glass. Through its body, I could see the floor of the stage, and beyond that, impossibly, other stages and other times, as if the instrument were a window to every performance that had ever been or would ever be. My vision blurred as the music reached a feverish pace. My arms burned with exertion, but still they moved, possessed by a will not my own. I was dimly aware that I was playing a solo now, the orchestra silent, all attention focused on my final performance. In the audience, I saw faces change, flickering between their spectral forms and living visages. For brief moments, they appeared as they had in life, young, old, from different eras and places, all united by their love of music and their cruel fate. The conductor turned fully toward me now, and at last, I caught a glimpse of what lay beneath the shadows that obscured its face. What I saw was not a face at all, but rather an absence, a void in the shape of human features, a negative space that pulled at my perception like a black hole pulls at light. And I understood then what the conductor truly was, not a being but a force, as old as human expression itself. The dark counterpoint to creation, the price of art made manifest. My bow drew across the strings one final time, producing a note that seemed to contain all music within it, beginning and end, joy and sorrow, creation and destruction. It hung in the air like a tangible thing, a bridge between worlds. As the note faded, I felt myself fading with it. My body had become almost entirely transparent, my substance converted to pure music. I could see through my own hands to the cello beneath them. The conductor lowered its baton, and with that simple gesture, my transformation was complete. I had become part of the eternal symphony, another lost soul in an orchestra of the forgotten, waiting for midnight and the next unfortunate music lover who would hear our call and join our ranks. 3 weeks later, a young woman named Elizabeth Chen pushed open the heavy oak doors of the abandoned concert hall. She clutched a flyer in her hand, Midnight Symphony, one night only, January 7th. A music student at the local university, she had become fascinated by the mysterious disappearance of Thomas Reed, the critic whose final known location had been this very building. The police investigation had yielded nothing. Reed had simply vanished, leaving behind only his car in the parking lot and a cryptic note in his apartment that read, "The music calls. I must answer." Elizabeth moved cautiously through the lobby, her flashlight beam cutting through thick layers of dust. According to the authorities, no one had been in this building for decades. The performance Reed had allegedly attended couldn't possibly have taken place here. Yet something had drawn him to this spot, and now that same inexplicable force had delivered an invitation to Elizabeth. As the university's most promising cello student, she had been intrigued by rumors that Reed had once been a cellist himself before abandoning performance for criticism. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing through the empty corridors. No answer came, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being observed. Shadows seemed to move at the corners of her vision, retreating whenever she turned to look directly at them. The beam of her flashlight revealed the entrance to the main concert hall ahead. Unlike the rest of the building, these doors appeared well maintained, their brass handles gleaming as if recently polished. Elizabeth checked her watch, 11:55. 5 minutes until midnight. Part of her, the sensible, rational part, urged her to leave, to call the police and report that someone was clearly using this condemned building. But a stronger impulse propelled her forward, a curiosity that transcended caution. She pressed her ear against the door. At first, she heard nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of an orchestra tuning up reached her, the discordant yet strangely beautiful chaos of dozens of instruments finding their voices. With trembling hands, she opened the door. The sight that greeted her defied all logic. The concert hall was immaculate, illuminated by hundreds of candles that cast a golden glow across polished wood and velvet seats. An audience sat in perfect stillness, facing the stage where an orchestra was arranged in traditional formation. Elizabeth's gaze was drawn immediately to the cellist, a translucent figure whose technique was flawless as he drew his bow across the strings. Though his features were difficult to discern, something about his posture, the tilt of his head, seemed familiar from photographs she had seen in newspaper articles about the missing critic. "Mr. Reed," she whispered. The cellist's head turned slightly, and for a moment, his form solidified enough for her to see his face clearly. His eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of sorrow and mourning. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear over the swelling music. But she could read them. "Run. While you still can." The door slammed shut behind her with a finality that sent ice through her veins. The sound drew the attention of the figure at the conductor's podium, a shape of impossible proportions that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It turned, baton paused midair, and Elizabeth felt its attention fix upon her like a physical weight. The orchestra fell silent, all eyes turning in her direction. Then, at the edge of the stage, a spotlight illuminated an empty chair. Beside it stood a cello, her cello, the one that had been in her family for generations. "This is impossible," she whispered. "I left it in my apartment." The conductor's baton moved, and the orchestra began to play again. This time, the music was familiar, the concerto Elizabeth had been practicing for her upcoming recital. But there was a gap in the arrangement, a space where her cello should be. An invitation. On stage, Thomas Reed's spectral form watched her with pleading eyes, shaking his head in silent mourning. Around him, dozens of other musicians, all in various states of transparency, played with mechanical precision, their expressions a mixture of resignation and rapture. Elizabeth took a step backward, then another, her back pressing against the doors that had closed behind her. She fumbled for the handle, but found only smooth wood where it had been moments before. The music swelled, wrapping around her like a physical presence, pulling her toward the stage with gentle but insistent pressure. Her feet began to move without her consent, carrying her down the center aisle. "No," she said, fighting against the invisible force. "I won't." The conductor's form seemed to expand, growing taller, its shadow stretching across the ceiling of the concert hall. The temperature plummeted, and Elizabeth's breath fogged in front of her face. Thomas Reed's ghost moved suddenly, his bow striking a discordant note that cut through the hypnotic symphony. The harsh sound broke whatever spell had been guiding Elizabeth's movements. She stumbled, regaining control of her limbs. The conductor turned toward Reed, its attention diverted momentarily from Elizabeth. The ghost cellist played louder, a chaotic series of notes that clashed violently with the ordered symphony around him. Elizabeth understood immediately he was creating a distraction. She scanned the concert hall desperately, looking for any possible escape. The main doors had vanished, but perhaps there was another way out. Her eyes settled on a small, unobtrusive door partially hidden behind a curtain near the right side of the stage, likely a maintenance entrance. Reed's rebellious playing had thrown the orchestra into confusion. Some phantom musicians continued with the original piece, while others had begun to follow Reed's discordant lead. The conductor's baton moved frantically, trying to regain control. Elizabeth seized the opportunity, darting toward the side door. Behind her, she heard a terrible sound, not music, but something between a scream and the shriek of tortured instruments. She didn't look back. The side door was locked, but unlike the main entrance, this lock was physical, a simple deadbolt. Elizabeth slammed her shoulder against the wood. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th impact, the aged frame splintered, and the door flew open. She stumbled into a narrow maintenance corridor, pitch black save for the beam of her flashlight. Behind her, the sounds from the concert hall had changed, the music replaced by a furious howling that made the walls around her vibrate. Elizabeth ran blindly down the corridor, following its twists and turns without any sense of direction. The building seemed to shift around her, passages appearing and disappearing, stairways leading to dead ends. The rational part of her mind knew this was impossible, yet the evidence of her senses couldn't be denied. After what felt like hours but might have been minutes, she rounded a corner and saw moonlight spilling through a window at the end of the hallway. An exit sign glowed above a door, a modern addition that seemed starkly out of place in the ancient building. She burst through the door into the cold night air, gasping as if she'd been underwater. Behind her, the concert hall stood silent and dark, its windows empty and broken just as they had been when she arrived. Elizabeth turned in a complete circle, disoriented. She was in an alley behind the building, far from where she had entered. Her car was nowhere in sight. As she stood trembling in the alley, she became aware of a sound, faint at first, then growing stronger. A cello, playing a piece she recognized as her own composition, one she had never shared with anyone. The music seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very air were vibrating with it. And woven into the melody, she could hear a voice, Thomas Reed's voice, though she had never heard it in life. "It will find you again," the voice whispered between notes. The conductor never forgets a musician. It will send another invitation. Be stronger than I was. The music faded, leaving behind in silence so profound it rang in her ears. Elizabeth fumbled for her phone with shaking hands, intending to call for help, but paused as her screen lit up. A notification appeared, an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read simply, "Midnight Symphony, 1 week, your final performance." She dropped the phone as if it had burned her. It clattered to the pavement, screen shattering on impact. But even through the broken glass, she could see the message remained, the words pulsing like a heartbeat. Elizabeth backed away, then turned and ran into the night, knowing as she fled that she couldn't escape what had already found her. The music was inside her now, a seed planted in fertile ground, growing with each terrified beat of her heart. Behind her, in the abandoned concert hall, a new chair appeared on stage beside Thomas Reed's, empty and waiting. In the orchestra pit, the conductor raised its baton once more, beginning the eternal symphony anew. The midnight performance continued, as it always had and always would, calling to those with music in their souls, collecting them one by one until the final note of time itself faded into silence. But perhaps, armed with foreknowledge and warning, Elizabeth might find a way to break the cycle. Or perhaps she would simply become another voice in the night symphony of lost souls, her music preserved forever at the cost of her mortal existence. Only the conductor knew for certain, and it wasn't telling. It was too busy playing. Have you ever felt words crawling under your skin, as if they were trying to rewrite you from the inside out? The old Blackwell Public Library stood like a monolith of faded grandeur at the edge of our small town. Its Victorian architecture, once impressive, now seemed to sag under the weight of decades. I found myself drawn to it during my research sabbatical, needing a quiet place away from the university's constant noise and expectations. My name is Thomas Harmon, a literature professor struggling with writer's block for the past 3 years. My academic career balanced on the precipice of irrelevance, and this small-town library represented my last desperate attempt to find inspiration. I hoped the change of scenery might unlock something in my stalled mind. The first thing I noticed upon entering was the smell, old paper, dust, and something else. Something faintly metallic. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Fletcher, barely looked up from her computer as I signed in, her fingers typing with surprising speed for someone her age. "We close at 8, she said flatly. "Special collections require written permission." I nodded, setting my laptop bag on a worn oak table near the back, where tall windows let in strips of gray autumn light. The library was nearly empty, just a college student nodding off in the periodicals section and a middle-aged man browsing military history. For 3 hours, I worked steadily through my notes, occasionally raising my head when the old building settled, its wooden beams creaking like arthritic joints. Around 6, the other patrons left, leaving me alone with Mrs. Fletcher, who disappeared into an office behind the circulation desk. That's when I noticed the first oddity. A book had appeared on my table, an old leather-bound volume without a dust jacket or identifying marks on its spine. I was certain it hadn't been there before. I glanced around, but the library remained empty. "Excuse me," I called toward the circulation desk, but received no answer. When I opened the book, the pages were blank except for a single line of elegant handwriting on the first page. They never let me finish my story. Perhaps you will. A chill brushed the back of my neck, my cold fingers trailing across my skin. I closed the book and pushed it away, attributing the strange feeling to fatigue and the building's draft. As I reached for my coffee thermos, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow sliding between bookshelves, too tall and too fluid to be human. When I turned fully, nothing was there. "Hello?" My voice sounded smaller than intended, swallowed by the cavernous ceiling and the dense rows of books. The shadow of doubt began to creep into my thoughts. Had I imagined it? The library's lights flickered briefly, and I noticed how the afternoon had darkened into evening without my awareness. The windows now reflected the interior rather than showing the outside world, making the library seem more isolated, like a pocket dimension separated from reality. I packed my belongings, deciding I'd done enough for one day. As I approached the circulation desk to check out the mysterious book, a gesture of academic curiosity rather than genuine interest, I found it empty. Mrs. Fletcher's coat remained on the rack, her computer still humming, but she was nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Fletcher? I called, leaning over the counter to peer into her office. The door stood ajar, a cup of tea steaming on her desk, but the room was empty. The silence of the library had transformed from peaceful to oppressive. Each step I took echoed too loudly, and the shadows between bookshelves seemed to deepen as if drawing back from my presence. The mysterious book felt heavier in my hand than its size warranted. As I stood uncertain, the lights flickered again, longer this time. In the momentary darkness, I heard what sounded like a pen scratching rapidly across paper, too fast for natural writing, more like a frantic scribbling of someone desperate to record thoughts before they vanished. When the lights returned, a note had appeared on the counter. Every writer leaves pieces of themselves behind. I left everything. Find me in the special collections. Bring my book. My rational mind suggested pranks or overtired hallucinations, but a deeper part recognized something genuinely wrong in the empty library. I should have left immediately. Instead, I found myself walking toward the special collections room, the leather book clutched against my chest like a shield. The door to special collections was unlocked, which Mrs. Fletcher had suggested was unusual. The room beyond lay in darkness except for a single reading lamp illuminating a desk in the center. As I approached, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath clouded before me. On the desk lay a manuscript, yellowed with age, open to a page filled with the same elegant handwriting as the note. The title read The Incomplete Works of Edward Wren. I had never heard the name before, but as I set down the blank leather book beside it, the pages of both books began to turn on their own, fluttering as if caught in a breeze where no breeze existed. The scratch of a pen started again, but this time I watched as invisible hands wrote across the blank pages of the leather book, "Thank you for bringing me what I need. Now I can begin again." The door to special collections closed behind me with a decisive click, and I knew with terrible certainty that I was not alone. The reading lamp flickered, casting elongated shadows across the special collections room. I stood frozen beside the desk, watching words materialize on pages that should have remained blank. The invisible pen continued its frantic dance, filling line after line with that elegant, ancient script. For 83 years, I've wandered these shelves, incomplete and forgotten. My hands trembled as I backed away from the desk. The rational part of my brain, the tenured professor who lectured on Gothic literature with academic detachment, scrambled for explanations. A prank. A hallucination from too much caffeine and too little sleep. Perhaps a gas leak affecting my perception. But the chill in the room penetrated my tweed jacket and settled into my bones. This cold felt intentional, directed, like it was observing my reactions. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The pen stopped. For several heartbeats, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the pages turned again, revealing new words. Edward Wren. They called me a master of horror once. Before they silenced me. The name triggered no recognition. In my 15 years of literary scholarship, I never encountered an Edward Wren in any canon or obscure collection. Yet something about the name resonated with a hollow familiarity, like a word forgotten mid-sentence. "What do you want from me?" I managed to ask, but my mouth had gone dry. The temperature dropped further. The reading lamp dimmed, and in the shadows between bookshelves, I caught movement, a figure forming from darkness. Not solid, but not quite transparent either. A man in outdated clothing, his face gaunt and his eyes, God, his eyes were pools of blank whiteness, like paper waiting for ink. I want what every writer wants, Professor Harmon. I want to be read. I want to finish what was taken from me. The apparition drifted closer, and I stumbled backward until I hit the closed door. My hand groped blindly for the handle, but it wouldn't turn. Locked or frozen, the result was the same. I was trapped. How do you know my name? I gasped. The ghost, because what else could it be, smiled. Not a warm expression, but the mechanical movement of facial muscles remembering a human gesture. I know all who enter my domain. I've watched you for days. Your frustration. Your fear of failure. We are not so different, you and I. Days? I'd only arrived in town 3 days ago. The thought that this entity had been observing me, perhaps following me back to my rented room at night, sent a wave of nausea through my body. What happened to Mrs. Fletcher? I demanded, trying to project authority I didn't feel. The ghost tilted its head, an oddly bird-like motion. The librarian? She left. They always leave at closing time. You didn't notice the hours passing, did you? Time moves differently when you're in the presence of my work. I checked my watch. 10:15. The library had closed over 2 hours ago. That's impossible, I muttered, though nothing about this situation adhered to the possible. The ghost of Edward Rand drifted to the desk, its form becoming more substantial as it neared the manuscript. One translucent hand reached toward the leather book, now half filled with writing. Nothing is impossible in stories, Professor. That's their power. Their danger, too. The pages continued turning, filling with text faster than human hands could write. I realized with mounting horror that the ghost was using me somehow, using my presence, perhaps even my creative energy, to manifest his work. Why me? I asked, a tremor in my voice. Because you understand the desperate hunger of needing to create. Because you're blocked. Empty. A perfect vessel. The room began to change subtly around us. The bookshelves seemed to stretch higher, the ceiling receding into darkness. The walls appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. Reality itself felt thin, as if the boundary between the physical world and imagination was dissolving. What are these stories about? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Professional curiosity, even in terror. The ghost's smile widened, revealing teeth too numerous and sharp to be human. They're about the darkness that waits in empty spaces. About the things that hunger behind reality. I was writing my masterpiece when they stopped me, a story that would tear the veil between worlds. They burned most copies, banned the rest. Then they came for me. A cold certainty settled in my stomach. Whatever Edward Rand had been writing in life, it wasn't mere fiction. The ghost's presence alone proved that some words held power beyond metaphor. Who stopped you? Those who guard the boundaries. They exist in every age, wearing different faces. Sometimes religions. Sometimes governments. Sometimes academics. The accusation in those blank eyes was unmistakable. I felt a sudden, irrational guilt, as if I personally had participated in silencing this writer. The ghost moved closer, its form flickering like a candle flame. I could smell ink and old paper mingled with something metallic, blood. I need you, Professor Harmon. Not just as a reader, but as a collaborator. My hands cannot hold a pen in your world. But you can write. Together, we'll finish what I started. And if I refuse? The question emerged as barely a whisper. The temperature plummeted. The ghost's expression hardened, its features becoming less human, more abstract, like a first draft of a person with details yet to be refined. Then you'll join my collection of unfinished works. So many have come before you. Their stories ended prematurely. As if responding to his words, the shadows in the corners of the room deepened and took shape. I glimpsed partial figures, a woman missing her left side, a man whose features blurred into nothingness below his eyes, a child reduced to a sketchy outline, all trapped in various states of incompletion. My legs gave way, and I slid down against the door to sit on the floor. The ghost of Edward Wren loomed over me, its form growing more solid by the minute. Choose, Professor. Be my hands, or become another unfinished character in my library. The blank book on the desk suddenly slammed shut, then reopened to a fresh page. A pen rose on its own, hovering expectantly in the air. Outside, beyond the library walls, thunder rolled across the night sky. But I knew with terrible certainty that no one would hear me if I screamed. In this space between reality and fiction, I was entirely alone with the phantom writer and his hungry, unfinished masterpiece. My fingers trembled as I approached the hovering pen. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but another part, the frustrated writer in me, the academic whose career was fading into irrelevance, felt a terrible curiosity. If I help you, I said carefully, what exactly would I be finishing? Edward Wren's ghost drifted around me, leaving trails of mist that smelled of old paper and chemical preservatives. The partial figures I glimpsed in the shadows had retreated, but I sensed them watching from the darkness between bookshelves. My magnum opus. The Thinning Veil. A work meant to transcend literature itself. The phantom moved to the yellowed manuscript on the desk, pages turning without being touched. They revealed elaborate diagrams intermixed with dense text, symbols I recognized from various occult traditions alongside others I'd never seen before. This isn't fiction, I whispered, understanding dawning with cold certainty. It's a ritual disguised as a novel. The ghost's smile stretched too wide across its face. All great literature transforms its readers, Professor. Mine simply takes that power to its logical conclusion. I swallowed hard, mind racing through what little I knew of Edward Wren. A writer of horror fiction, apparently prolific enough to have been known in his time, yet completely absent from literary history. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase him from cultural memory. What happens if the book is completed? I asked, already suspecting the answer. Reality becomes permeable. The boundaries weaken. Those who have been kept out may enter. Those who have been trapped inside may leave. The ghost's form flickered, becoming momentarily more substantial, enough for me to see details I'd missed before. A thin red line around his neck. Bruising on his wrists. This was not a man who had died peacefully. You were executed, I said flatly. They called it suicide. Convenient, how many troublesome writers hang themselves in their cells. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold. Literary history was full of suspicious deaths, disappearances, and censorship. How many other Edward Wrens had been systematically erased? The hovering pen tapped impatiently against the blank page. The ghost drifted closer, its form elongating unnaturally. Enough questions. Right, Professor. Your academic curiosity can be satisfied after you've helped me. My hand moved toward the pen, then hesitated. Show me what happened to the others who refused you. The ghost went still, its form sharpening with what I interpreted as anger. Then, unexpectedly, it laughed, a sound like pages being rapidly flipped. As you wish. A practical demonstration may prove motivating. Edward Wren's ghost glided to a shadowy corner and gestured. The darkness parted like a curtain, revealing a hidden alcove lined with glass display cases. Inside each was a book. No, not books. Journals. Diaries. Modern notebooks. With growing horror, I approached the nearest case. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with the name Daniel Whitaker, 1937. The ghost opened the case with a wave, and the journal rose into the air, pages flipping open. The handwriting started neat and academic, detailing the writer's research into obscure literary figures. Then it grew increasingly frantic, describing encounters with a presence in the library. The final entries deteriorated into mad scrawls, ending mid-sentence, "The words are inside me now, moving under my skin like." What happened to him? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. He refused to write what I needed, so I wrote on him instead. The ghost waved again, and a photograph fluttered out from between the journal's pages. It showed a man's body discovered in his home, his skin covered in tiny, precise handwriting, the same elegant script as Edward Wren's. The autopsy report clipped to the photo listed the cause of death as unknown. My stomach lurched. And the others? Some became vessels. Some became characters. Some simply provided raw materials. The ghost gestured to more display cases, each containing the personal effects and final writings of researchers, writers, and librarians stretching back decades. All had come to the Blackwell Library. None had left unchanged. With horrifying clarity, I understood my situation. Edward Wren wasn't simply a ghost, he was something worse. A literary parasite, using words to bridge the gap between death and life, fiction and reality. "I won't help you," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Whatever you're trying to bring through that thinning veil, it needs to stay on its side." The ghost's form darkened, stretching toward the ceiling like spilled ink climbing upward. "Then you leave me no choice but to use you differently." The temperature plummeted further. Frost crystallized on the display cases. The shadows in the corners began to move, the partial figures emerging, the unfinished victims of Edward Wren's literary experiments. I backed away, searching desperately for anything to use as a weapon or shield. My professor's mind raced through folklore and fiction. How did one fight a ghost? Salt? Iron? Fire? The hovering pen suddenly shot forward like a dart, narrowly missing my eye and embedding itself in the wooden door behind me. As I ducked, my elbow knocked against a shelf, dislodging several books that crashed to the floor. Among them was a slim volume bound in red leather. It fell open, revealing a familiar handwriting, Edward Wren's, but the text was different from his manuscript. This appeared to be a journal. The ghost screamed, a sound like paper tearing, and lunged for the fallen book. I dove for it first, clutching it to my chest as I rolled behind a heavy oak table. "Give that to me." The ghost's voice scraped against my mind like nails on chalkboard. Frantically, I flipped through the journal, searching for anything that might help me. The entries dated from 1941 to 1942, documenting Wren's growing obsession with what he called narrative realities and textual manifestation. The final entry caught my eye. April 17th, 1942, they're coming for me tonight. The librarians have discovered what my work can do. My physical form will not survive, but I've prepared. The special collections room contains the sympathetic materials needed. My essence will transfer to my unfinished manuscript. There I'll wait for someone worthy to complete my work. Critical weakness, the vessel must be willing. If they destroy my original manuscript, my essence will unravel. I've hidden it where they'll never. The journal was ripped from my hands by an invisible force. Pages tore free, swirling through the air like angry butterflies. Edward Wren's ghost had grown massive, filling the ceiling of the special collections room, its form shifting between human and something alien, letters and words forming and reforming in its substance. You think knowledge will save you? I am knowledge. Books flew from shelves, their pages erupting outward in a blizzard of paper. The ghost's laughter echoed as text from hundreds of volumes swirled into its growing form. But in that moment of chaotic distraction, I spotted something crucial, a safe built into the wall behind the desk, partially visible where a section of bookshelf had swung outward during the supernatural upheaval. The original manuscript. It had to be. I lunged forward, ducking under flying books and torn pages. The ghost shrieked, realizing my intention too late. My fingers grasped the handle of the safe, finding it unlocked, perhaps opened by the same supernatural forces that had exposed it. Inside lay a manuscript identical to the one on the desk, but this one seemed more substantial somehow. More real. The ghost of Edward Wren descended upon me like a tidal wave of ink and rage. You cannot unmake me. My hand closed around the original manuscript as darkness engulfed me. The last thing I felt was the sensation of words crawling across my skin, seeking entrance. Consciousness returned in fragments, like torn pages slowly being reassembled. I found myself sprawled on the special collections room floor, the original manuscript clutched to my chest. My shirt clung to my skin, wood with something that smelled metallic. When I looked down, I saw dark stains spreading across the fabric, ink mixed with blood. The ghost of Edward Wren hovered near the ceiling, its form fluctuating wildly between human and abstract patterns of text. The room had transformed around us, bookshelves bent at impossible angles, their contents spilling onto a floor that seemed to ripple like disturbed water. Reality itself felt thin, as if the physical world had become as malleable as fiction. Return what is mine, the ghost demanded, its voice reverberating from every surface. You cannot comprehend what you interfere with. I struggled to my feet, using a twisted shelf for support. My skin burned where the ink-blood mixture touched it, and with mounting horror, I realized the liquid was moving, forming letters that crawled across my flesh like insects. What's happening to me? I gasped, trying to wipe away the animated text. The ghost descended, its face almost sorrowful despite its rage. The manuscript requires a vessel. If not willingly given purpose through collaboration, it takes purpose by force. You refuse to write for me, so now my words write themselves upon you. I looked down at my arms, watching as tiny lines of text spiraled around my wrists and up toward my elbows, etching themselves into my skin. Each word that formed brought a sharp, burning pain, and with it, foreign thoughts and images invaded my mind, scenes of cosmic horror and entities that existed beyond conventional dimensions. Make it stop, I pleaded, dropping to my knees as the pain intensified. I cannot. Once begun, the transfer must complete. Your identity will be overridden. Your body will house my consciousness. My work will continue through your hands. Through the haze of pain and mounting dissociation, my academic mind grasped at straws of logic. If Edward Wren needed a willing vessel, he could force himself upon an unwilling one. There must be a difference in outcomes. A weakness. What happens? I manage through gritted teeth if the vessel fights back. The ghost flickered, its expression betraying concern for the first time. Corrupted text. Failed translation. But the cost to the vessel is severe. I understood then. Edward Wren needed complete surrender for his work to manifest properly. Resistance would damage both the manuscript and myself, but might prevent whatever dark ritual he was attempting. The text had reached my shoulders now, crawling up my neck like ants. Each word that formed pulled me further from myself, replacing memories and thoughts with Wren's literary consciousness. I felt myself being erased character by character. With the last of my strength, I pressed my hands against the original manuscript, focusing on the one power I still possessed, my own voice as a writer and scholar. This text is rejected, I declared, focusing every remaining ounce of my academic authority into the words. The review finds it derivative, poorly structured, and lacking scholarly merit. Publication denied. The ghost screamed, a sound like paper being shredded. The manuscript in my hands grew hot, pages fluttering wildly. You cannot. My work is genius. I continued, drawing on every biting critique I'd ever delivered or received. The author demonstrates fundamental misunderstandings of genre conventions. The symbolism is heavy-handed. The prose is purple and self-indulgent. Each critical assessment seemed to cause the ghost physical pain. The text crawling across my skin slowed, letters becoming jumbled and incoherent. I was fighting Wren with the most devastating weapon in academia, a scathing peer review. The research is inadequate, the conclusions unsupported by evidence. The journal rejects this submission and discourages resubmission. The manuscript began to smoke in my hands, edges browning as if exposed to intense heat. The ghost of Edward Wren contorted, its form stretching and compressing unnaturally. Stop! You're destroying decades of work. The author's attempts at innovation merely highlight his derivative influences. The text adds nothing of value to the existing literature. With each critical assessment, the writing on my skin grew fainter. The foreign thoughts invading my mind receded, allowing me to reclaim pieces of my identity. But the effort was draining me rapidly. My vision blurred, consciousness threatening to slip away. The ghost launched itself at me, a wave of furious text and spectral rage. I held the manuscript up like a shield, continuing my critique even as supernatural darkness closed around me. The narrative collapses under the weight of its own pretensions. The characters lack believable motivation. The conclusion is both predictable and unsatisfying. The manuscript erupted into flames, bright, unnatural fire that consumed the pages without burning my hands. Edward Wren's ghost wailed, its form fragmenting into disconnected words and phrases that swirled around the room like a textual hurricane. What have you done? Without my work, I am nothing. The unfinished figures emerged from the shadows again, but now they moved with purpose, advancing on the disintegrating ghost. I recognized the silent fury in their incomplete faces, Wren's previous victims, bound to him through his unfinished works, now freed as his power unraveled. Your story is over, Edward Wren, I said, watching as the manuscript crumbled to ash in my hands. Some works are better left incomplete. The ghost's form collapsed inward, reducing to a small, dense knot of text that pulsated with diminishing light. The partial figures surrounded it, their fragmented hands reaching out to claim what remained of their tormentor. This isn't the end, Wren's voice echoed, now distant and fading. Stories never truly die. They wait. They return. Someone will find my words again. Perhaps, I acknowledged. But your current draft is rejected. With those final words, the ghost of Edward Rand imploded like a dying star, leaving behind nothing but scattered letters that faded into the air. The partial figures bowed to me in silent gratitude before they too dissolved, their incomplete forms finally finding release. The special collections room shuddered, reality snapping back into place. Bookshelves straightened, fallen books returned to their proper places, and the unnatural cold dissipated. Sunlight suddenly streamed through windows that hadn't been there before, revealing that morning had come. I looked down at my arms. The text had vanished from my skin, leaving behind faint red traces like healing scratches. But when I rolled up my sleeve, I discovered a single line of text remained etched into my forearm. Every story seeks its ending. The door to the special collections room swung open. Mrs. Fletcher stood there, keys in hand, staring at me with wide eyes. Professor Harmon? How did you get in here? The library doesn't open for another hour. I had no answer that wouldn't sound like madness. Instead, I gathered my belongings, noting that both the blank leather book and Edward Rand's manuscript had vanished without a trace. I must have fallen asleep doing research, I said, the light coming easily. I apologized for the confusion. Mrs. Fletcher frowned, clearly suspicious but unwilling to press further. Well, you'll need to leave and come back during regular hours. Library policy. I nodded and walked past her on unsteady legs. As I reached the main entrance, something compelled me to ask, Mrs. Fletcher, have you ever heard of a writer named Edward Wren? She paused, key halfway to the lock. Can't say that I have. Should I know the name? No, I said after a moment. He's very obscure. Mostly forgotten. Outside, the morning air felt impossibly sweet and clean. I walked through town toward my rented room, each step taking me further from the nightmare in the special collections room. But with each step, I also felt the weight of a new compulsion growing within me, an urgent need to write. Not Edward Rand's unfinished masterpiece, but a warning. A scholarly paper on literary erasure. A catalog of forgotten writers whose works might contain more than mere fiction. Because Rand had been right about one thing, stories never truly die. They wait in dusty archives and forgotten collections. They hide between the lines of history. And some of them hunger for completion. 3 months after my encounter in the Blackwell Library, I sat in my university office, staring at my computer screen. Outside, winter had settled across campus, students hurrying between buildings with hunched shoulders and steaming cups of coffee. Inside, despite the radiator's efforts, I couldn't shake the persistent chill that had followed me since that night. My sabbatical had ended, and I've returned to teaching with a renewed vigor that surprised my colleagues. My writer's block had shattered completely, words flowed with unsettling ease, sometimes faster than I could type them. My latest paper on literary erasure and censorship in the early 20th century had been accepted by 3 prestigious journals. I never mentioned Edward Rand specifically in my academic work. Some names are better left uncited. The mark on my forearm had faded to a thin white scar, but the words remained legible. Every story seeks its ending. I kept it covered with long sleeves, even in the summer heat. My doctor had examined it with puzzled concern, eventually diagnosing it as dermatographia with an unusual persistence. I didn't correct him. What concerned me more were the dreams. Night after night, I found myself wandering endless library corridors, shelves stretching into darkness above me. Books whispered as I passed, their pages rustling with conversations I almost understood. Sometimes I glimpse the partial figures from the special collections room, now more substantial, watching me from shadowed alcoves with something like expectation. I'd wait gasping, my fingers cramped as if I'd been writing in my sleep. Sometimes I had been, my bed sheets covered in scrawled notes and fragments of stories I didn't remember conceiving. The tap at my office door pulled me from these troubling thoughts. Jennifer Blake stood in the doorway, a promising graduate student whose dissertation examined supernatural elements in American Gothic literature. "Professor Harmon? Do you have a moment?" she asked, clutching a folder to her chest. "Of course, Jennifer. Come in." I gestured to the chair opposite my desk, closing the document I'd been working on, notes for a book I wasn't ready to acknowledge I was writing. She sat, nervousness evident in her posture. "I found something strange while researching my dissertation. I thought you might be interested, given your recent work on literary censorship." She opened the folder, revealing photocopies of newspaper clippings and what appeared to be official documents from the 1940s. "I was in the National Archives last week and came across sealed records that had just been declassified. They detail a government program called the Literary Containment Initiative that operated from 1939 to 1963. They were monitoring and sometimes removing writers whose work was deemed reality-threatening." My mouth went dry. "Reality-threatening?" Jennifer nodded, pushing a photocopied memo toward me. "That was their actual classification. They believed certain texts could alter consensus reality if widely read. Most were occult texts, but some were fiction writers." I scanned the document, my heart pounding when I reached a list of contained authors. Halfway down, in bureaucratic type as mundane as a grocery list, Wren, Edward J., status, neutralized, 1942. "Have you shared this with anyone else?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice neutral. "Just Professor Lewis in the history department, but he dismissed it as Cold War paranoia." She leaned forward, eyes bright with academic excitement. "But what if it wasn't? What if they really found texts that could change things?" "A fascinating hypothesis," I said carefully, "but difficult to prove without access to the texts themselves." "That's just it," Jennifer said, pulling out another document. "The files indicate that while most copies were destroyed, complete archives of the confiscated works were maintained in what they called secure repositories. And I think I've located one." She pointed to a coded location reference. With a cold shock of recognition, I realized it described the special collections room of the Blackwell Public Library. "Jennifer," I said slowly, "I think you should consider a different dissertation topic." Her enthusiasm faltered. "But this could be groundbreaking research. No one has examined these records before. Which should tell you something." I held her gaze. "Some academic pursuits carry risks beyond professional rejection. You sound like you're speaking from experience, Professor." I rolled up my sleeve, revealing the scar text on my forearm. Jennifer's eyes widened. "What happened to you?" she whispered. "I read something I shouldn't have. Something unfinished." I rolled my sleeve down again. "There are writers whose works were suppressed not for political or moral reasons, but because they discovered how thin the boundary is between fiction and reality. Between words and worlds." Jennifer stared at me, her academic skepticism warring with the evidence before her. "The Blackwell Library Special Collections," I continued, "is not somewhere you want to conduct solitary research. Trust me on this." She swallowed hard, then nodded. "I'll reconsider my approach." A wise decision. I gathered her documents, returning them to the folder. "May I keep these for review?" I might have additional insights after examining them more carefully. After Jennifer left, I locked my office door and examined the files more thoroughly. The Literary Containment Initiative had been more extensive than I imagined, with operations across the country targeting dozens of writers whose works demonstrated reality-altering potential. Edward Rand hadn't been an isolated case. He was part of a pattern, a literary movement that had been systematically erased from history. As night fell outside my office window, I continued poring over Jennifer's documents. The Literary Containment Initiative had operated with frightening efficiency, erasing not just the writers themselves but their entire literary footprints, reviews, interviews, public appearances, all methodically scrubbed from the historical record. A memo dated 1954 outlined their methodology. Complete removal requires elimination of both primary texts and secondary discourse. The author must become not merely obscure but non-existent in public consciousness. I thought of Edward Wren, a man apparently significant enough in his time to warrant government intervention, yet completely absent from literary history until his ghost had forced its way back into the world through me. My phone rang, startling me from these dark reflections. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with the Blackwell area code. Professor Harmon? A woman's voice, tremulous with age. This is Margaret Fletcher from the Blackwell Library. Mrs. Fletcher, I said, surprised. What can I do for you? Something's happening here. Something, like before. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It started again after you left. Books rearranging themselves. Writing appearing on blank pages. And this special collections room, the door won't stay locked. My scar pulsed with phantom pain. Have you contacted anyone else? Who would believe me? But you know what happened. You were there. I closed my eyes, fighting the urge to hang up, to pretend this call had never come. But I knew too much now. The documents spread before me confirmed that Edward Wren was merely one strand in a larger tapestry of suppressed literary power. I'll come tomorrow, I said finally. Don't enter the special collections room until I arrive. There's something else, Mrs. Fletcher added, her voice even softer. A new librarian started last week. Young man, very efficient. Claims he transferred from the university archive, but I've checked, they have no record of him. What's his name? I asked, already dreading the answer. Edward Winters. The phone nearly slipped from my suddenly numb fingers. Keep your distance from him. I'll be there first thing tomorrow. After hanging up, I turned back to my computer, opening the document I'd been avoiding for weeks. Titled simply Unfinished, it contained fragments of what I could only describe as automatic writing, text that had flowed from my fingers during late nights when exhaustion blurred the line between conscious composition and something else entirely. Reading it now with fresh eyes, I recognized elements of Edward Wren's style intertwined with my own, the elegant phrasing, the disturbing imagery, the sense of reality fraying at its edges. But where his work had sought to thin the veil between worlds, mine seemed to be cataloging those worlds, mapping them, perhaps even strengthening the boundaries. With growing certainty, I understood what had happened in this special collections room. When I destroyed Wren's original manuscript, something of his literary essence had transferred to me, not as possession but as inheritance. A passing of knowledge that had been too dangerous in his hands but might serve a different purpose in mine. The mark on my arm burned again, the words seeming to shift beneath my skin. Every story seeks its ending. Every writer, their successor. I began to pack essentials for the trip to Blackwell, clothes, my laptop, and most importantly, the nearly completed manuscript of Unfinished. Whatever awaited me at the library, I sensed my own work would be crucial in confronting it. As I zipped my bag, a shadow passed across my office window, too large for a bird, too fluid for a person. When I looked up, nothing was there but darkness. Yet for a moment, I could have sworn I saw words forming in the condensation on the glass. "See you soon, Professor." The Blackwell Library stood unchanged in the winter morning light, its Victorian architecture stark against the gray sky. Snow had fallen overnight, leaving the building looking like an illustration from a Gothic novel, isolated and foreboding. Mrs. Fletcher met me at the service entrance, her face pale with lack of sleep. "He's already inside," she whispered, hands shaking as she unlocked the door. Always the first to arrive, last to leave. We entered silently through the staff area, making our way to Mrs. Fletcher's office overlooking the main floor. Through the small window, I could see a man shelving books in the reference section, tall, thin, with meticulous movements. He appeared perfectly ordinary, yet something about his precision felt inhuman. Has he tried to access the special collections? I asked. "Every day," she replied. "I've changed the locks twice. Each morning, I find the door standing open." I removed my laptop from my bag, opening the document I'd been working on. "I need to see that room, Mrs. Fletcher." "Alone." She hesitated, then handed me a key. "The catalog says it's for the storage closet, but it's another copy for special collections. I had it made after what happened with you." As I took the key, our fingers touched briefly. A jolt passed between us, and her eyes widened in shock. "You're different," she said, staring at me. "There's something written on you. Not just your arm, everywhere. I can almost see it." I nodded grimly. "A side effect of surviving Edward Wren. I'm hoping it's also the solution." I waited until Edward Winters moved to the periodicals section, then slipped from the office and made my way to the special collections room. The key turned smoothly in the lock, but the door resisted slightly, as if something on the other side pushed back. When it finally swung open, I immediately understood Mrs. Fletcher's concern. The room had changed. Where before it had held neat shelves of rare books and archival materials, now the walls seemed to ripple with hidden text, thousands of words just below the surface, like literary fossils embedded in the plaster. The display cases containing Edward Wren's previous victims were gone, but the center desk remained, now piled with blank journals and unopened ink bottles. Waiting. Expectant. I placed my laptop on the desk and opened the document. As the screen illuminated, the words on the walls seemed to react, shifting, aligning themselves with my text. I understood then that what I'd been writing wasn't merely a book. It was a counterweight, a literary anchor designed to stabilize the reality that Wren had tried to distort. Fascinating work, Professor. Though the conclusion needs strengthening. I turned to find Edward Winters standing in the doorway, his form now flickering between solid human and something more abstract, a collection of literary devices given temporary shape. Not Wren's ghost exactly, but something he had created. A character made real, seeking its author. "You're not him," I said with sudden certainty. "You're something he wrote. A protagonist, perhaps." The figure smiled, the expression perfect yet somehow rehearsed. "Perceptive. Edward Wren created me as his ideal self, the writer he aspired to be. When his physical form was destroyed, I remained trapped within his unfinished masterpiece. Until you freed us all." "Us?" I asked, though I already knew. his characters, his creatures, the inhabitants of his literary universe. The figure glanced at the walls, where the hidden text pulsed like a heartbeat. We were never meant to be merely words on a page. We were meant to transcend. I stood my ground, one hand resting on my open laptop. And now you're trying to finish what he started. With modifications. The figure moved further into the room, its movements too fluid to be human. Rin wanted to bring something through from beyond. We simply want to exist. To be read. To be remembered. It gestured toward my manuscript. As do you, Professor. Every writer fears oblivion. The truth of those words resonated uncomfortably. Wasn't that what had driven me all these years? The desperate academic hunger to publish, to be cited, to leave some permanent mark on the world? I can offer you literary immortality, the figure continued, voice hypnotic. Your work and mine merged into something unprecedented. A text that rewrites reality itself. For a moment, I felt the temptation, the siren call of creating something truly transformative. Then I remembered the partial figures, trapped between existence and erasure. The government files documenting neutralized authors. The price of such literary ambition. No, I said firmly. Some stories need to remain unfinished. I turned to my laptop and began to type, adding the final paragraphs to unfinished, not an ending, but a deliberate non-ending. A literary structure designed to absorb and contain unstable narratives. The figure that called itself Edward Winters lunged forward, its form dissolving into a swarm of animated text that engulfed me. Words crawled across my skin, seeking entrance through eyes, mouth, even pores. I kept typing blindly, fingers finding keys through muscle memory as the room around us transformed. Reality bent. The walls of the special collections room expanded to impossible dimensions, shelves extending infinitely in all directions. Books flew from their places, pages fluttering like wings as they circled us in a literary cyclone. Through this chaos, I completed my work, a textual structure that functioned as both prison and preservation. A literary containment system not to erase these dangerous narratives, but to hold them safely within the realm of fiction where they belonged. As I typed the final period, everything froze. The swirling pages, the animated text, the figure of Edward Winters, all suspended in perfect literary stasis. Then, slowly, they began to fold inward, compressing into the digital pages of my manuscript like characters returning to their proper places in a story. The room shuddered, then settled back into ordinary dimensions. The walls became solid again, the shelves returned to their normal state. But the books were different now, each spine bearing the title Unfinished Collections followed by a volume number. An entire series cataloging dangerous narratives safely contained within conventional fiction. I slumped back in the chair, physically exhausted but mentally clear for the first time in months. The scar text on my arm had vanished completely, the mark of Edward Wren finally erased. Mrs. Fletcher found me there an hour later, staring at the newly organized special collections. It's over, I told her. They've been contained. Properly this time. She surveyed the room with wary relief. And Edward Winters? A character returned to his story. I closed my laptop. He won't trouble you again. As I prepared to leave Blackwell for the last time, Mrs. Fletcher handed me a library card. Honorary lifetime membership, she explained. Though I hope you'll use it from a distance. I plan to, I assured her. Some research is better conducted remotely. Back at the university, I submitted my resignation the following week. Academic life no longer held the same appeal, not after glimpsing the true power of words to shape or unravel reality. Instead, I accepted a position with a small, unmarked government office that had contacted me shortly after my return. The Literary Containment Initiative had evolved over the decades, its methods becoming more sophisticated than the crude censorship of earlier eras. Now they sought to understand and preserve dangerous narratives rather than destroy them. My office sits in a nondescript building in Washington, D.C., my title deliberately vague, Literary Assessment Specialist. My days are spent evaluating texts flagged for their unusual properties, books that seem to predict future events with uncomfortable accuracy, manuscripts whose readers report strange phenomena, digital stories that alter themselves between readings. Most prove harmless, mere coincidences or overactive imaginations. But occasionally, I find something genuine, words with weight beyond their meaning, narratives with gravitational pulls that distort surrounding reality. These I contain within my ongoing work, unfinished collections, now spanning 23 volumes. Not destroyed or censored, but contextualized and controlled. Remembered, but safely fictionalized. At night, I sometimes dream of Edward Wren, not as the vengeful ghost I encountered, but as he might have been in life, a writer discovering the terrible power of his craft. I wonder if he began as I did, with simple literary ambition, before being consumed by the potential of his words. In these dreams, he sits across from me in a library that exists nowhere on earth, countless books stretching into infinity around us. Every story seeks its ending, he says, his voice no longer threatening but weary with hard-won wisdom. But not all endings are conclusions, I reply. Some are simply new beginnings. He nods, and together we write words that will never be read, stories too powerful to exist outside of dreams. When I wake, I return to my work, cataloging literary dangers and containing them within the safest prison ever devised, the clear understanding that they are merely fiction. Nothing more. But in my most honest moments, staring at my reflection as I prepare for another day, I sometimes glimpse faint text beneath my skin, not Edward Wren's elegant script, but my own academic handwriting. Words working their way outward, seeking expression. And I wonder, have I contained these dangerous narratives? Or have they contained me? The answer, I suspect, depends on who is reading whom. Do you ever wonder what the dead leave behind when they go? The question hung in the air like morning mist as I stood at my apartment window, staring at the cityscape of Boston. 3 weeks into my new job at the local newspaper, and already the city felt different. Not welcoming, not hostile, just watching. My name is Michael Reeves, 32 years old, divorced, and trying to rebuild what remained of my life in this sprawling metropolis. The small 2-bedroom apartment on the 14th floor gave me a perfect view of the eastern suburbs, where the new development project had stalled after a series of unexplained accidents. That morning started like any other. The alarm blared at 5:30, and I dragged myself from bed to watch the sunrise, a ritual I had maintained since childhood. But something was different. The air felt heavy, pressing against my skin like wet cotton. My breath fogged the window even though it was mid-April and fairly warm. Then I saw it, just at the edge of Franklin Park, where the old factory had been demolished last year. A shimmer in the air, like heat rising from asphalt, except it was moving. Not randomly, but with purpose. The shape resembled a human figure, tall and slender, pacing back and forth at the edge of the tree line. I blinked, and it disappeared. Just tired, I muttered, turning away to start the coffee maker. But my hand trembled as I scooped the grounds, and a chill crawled up my spine despite the warmth of my apartment. At work, I couldn't focus. My editor, Blake, noticed immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Reeves," he said, dropping a stack of research materials on my desk. "The East Side development piece is due tomorrow. I need you sharp." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just didn't sleep well." Blake studied me with narrow eyes. "Well, pull it together. This story could be your break." Strange things happening at the construction site. Workers quitting without explanation. Might be environmental concerns or labor issues, but something's off. If only he knew how right he was. That evening, I drove to the development site. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Ron, recognized me from previous interviews and waved me through. The site was eerily quiet, construction equipment abandoned mid-project, portable offices with doors left ajar, safety helmets still on desks. "Nobody comes here after 4 anymore," Ron explained, following my gaze. "Not since the Jenkins incident." "Jenkins?" I asked, feeling my reporter instincts kick in. Ron shifted uncomfortably. "Project manager. Good guy. Found him wandering the foundation pits one morning, muttering about echoes and shadows without people. Had some kind of breakdown. His wife said he'd been complaining about hearing crying at dawn." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "When was this?" 3 weeks ago. Right when you started asking questions." Ron checked his watch nervously. "Sun's going down soon. You should leave." I nodded but had no intention of going home. Instead, I parked my car a block away and waited until Ron's shift ended at 8. Then I slipped back onto the property with my camera and digital recorder. The silence was absolute. No distant traffic, no birds, not even the usual urban white noise that pervades city life. Just emptiness and the strange sensation of being watched. I walked along the concrete foundation, taking photos and notes. Nothing seemed unusual until I reached the eastern corner of the property. There, the air felt different, colder, denser. My breath came out in visible puffs despite the mild spring evening. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, like someone exhaling slowly. Then another. And another. A rhythm of sighs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, heart pounding. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, but the sighing continued, growing more distinct. Now it sounded less like breathing and more like words, whispered just below the threshold of comprehension. My digital recorder picked up nothing but static when I played it back. But my skin knew better, something was speaking. As darkness fell completely, the sighing faded. But something else took its place, a subtle movement in the shadows. Not the familiar shifting of darkness caused by passing cars or swaying trees. This was purposeful. The shadows were moving independently of their sources. I backed away slowly, nearly tripping over a stack of metal pipes. My camera flashed accidentally, illuminating the area for a split second. There, at the far end of the foundation, stood a figure. Translucent, wavering like smoke, but unmistakably human in form. It raised what might have been an arm, pointing directly at me. I ran. My feet pounded the dirt as I sprinted toward my car, not daring to look back. The whispers grew louder behind me, now clearly forming words. "Come, see what we became." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pointing figure, its body rippling like disturbed water. I told myself it was exhaustion, a trick of light, my imagination fueled by Ron's story. But deep down, I knew better. Because when I uploaded the photos to my laptop, most showed nothing unusual except for the last accidental shot. There, barely visible against the darkness, was not one figure but dozens. Silhouettes of people arranged in a perfect circle around the foundation pit. And at the center, a darker shadow, twisted into a shape no living body could form. The photo's timestamp read 5:17 a.m., dawn from yesterday morning. But I had taken it at night. That's when I realized whatever walked the construction site didn't just appear at dawn. It was waiting for it. The next morning, I woke with a start, my sheets damp with sweat. The digital clock read 5:15 minutes before dawn. My heart pounded as I remembered the photograph and the timestamp. Without thinking, I rushed to the window. The sky held that peculiar blue-gray color that precedes sunrise, neither night nor day. My eyes immediately fixed on the distant construction site. Even from 14 floors up and several blocks away, I could see them, dozens of shimmering forms gathering around the foundation pit, like mourners at a grave. I grabbed my phone and tried to capture what I was seeing, but the camera showed nothing unusual, just an abandoned construction site in the dim morning light. Yet with my naked eyes, I could see them clearly now, translucent figures moving in synchronized patterns, their forms rippling like heat mirages. Then, as the first ray of sunlight broke over the horizon, they vanished. Not gradually, but instantly, their one moment, gone the next. My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. Blake's number flashed on the screen. "Reeves, get down to the East Side site now," he barked without preamble. Police tape everywhere. Some night watchman found something. "Ron?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "How'd you know?" Blake sounded surprised. "Yeah, Ron Miller. Not dead, if that's what you're thinking, but close to it. Catatonic. Paramedics found him sitting in his security booth, staring at nothing. Been there all night." I dressed quickly, my mind racing. By the time I reached the construction site, police and paramedics were already packing up. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, and a small crowd of onlookers had gathered despite the early hour. I flashed my press credentials to a tired-looking officer who waved me through with minimal interest. The site felt different in daylight, ordinary, just abandoned concrete and steel. But the security booth where Ron had been found stood open, its interior illuminated by the morning sun. Something caught my eye, marks on the inside of the glass. I moved closer, pretending to take notes on my phone while snapping pictures. The marks were handprints, dozens of them, as if many people had pressed their palms against the glass from inside the small booth. But they weren't normal handprints, they were frosted onto the glass, like breath condensation, yet perfectly preserved. Those weren't made by any living person. I turned to find a woman standing beside me. She was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her clothes were expensive but understated, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone used to authority. "Dr. Eleanor Reed," she offered, extending her hand. "I consult for the police on certain, unusual cases." "Michael Reeves, Boston Chronicle," I replied, shaking her hand. Her grip was cool and firm. "What makes you say that about the handprints?" She studied me with intelligent eyes. "Because living hands leave oils, moisture, unique patterns. These are identical, each one a perfect copy of the others. And they're too cold." I raised an eyebrow. "Cold? How can a handprint be cold?" "Touch the glass," she suggested. Hesitantly, I placed my palm against the window next to one of the frosted handprints. A shock of cold ran up my arm, so intense I jerked back with a gasp. The glass around the handprint wasn't just cool, it was freezing, as if in direct contact with dry ice. Impossible, I muttered. Many things are, until they happen, Dr. Reed remarked. She handed me her card. I've read your articles, Mr. Reeves. You ask questions others don't think to ask. If you discover anything relevant to my interests, please call. She walked away before I could respond. The card simply read Dr. Eleanor Reed, Temporal Phenomena Research. That afternoon, I visited Ron Miller at Massachusetts General Hospital. He sat in his bed, eyes fixed on the middle distance, unresponsive to nurses and doctors. His wife Susan sat beside him, holding his limp hand. Has he said anything? I asked gently after introducing myself. Susan shook her head, then paused. Just one thing, when they first found him. The paramedic wrote it down because it didn't make sense. She pulled a crumpled note from her purse and handed it to me. In neat medical handwriting, someone had written, "Patient repeated they're playing it backward approximately 20 times before falling silent." Playing what backward? I asked. I don't know, Susan whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Ron was always so rational. He didn't believe in anything supernatural or religious. He was just a normal guy doing a normal job. That night, I couldn't stay away from the site. Something was pulling me there, a compulsion beyond curiosity or journalistic instinct. I parked several blocks away and approached on foot, carrying my camera, recorder, and a new purchase, a thermal imaging attachment for my phone. The security booth was dark, the replacement guard nowhere to be seen. I slipped under the tape and made my way to the foundation pit. The night was cloudless, stars visible even through the city's light pollution. The air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. I switched on the thermal imager and slowly scanned the area. Everything appeared as expected, cold concrete, slightly warmer metal pipes, the ambient temperature gradient of normal objects. Until I pointed it at the center of the foundation. The screen showed a perfect circle of cold, not just cool, but deep blue-black, indicating temperatures well below freezing. And within that circle, shapes were moving. Human-shaped heat signatures, but inverted, they registered as colder than their surroundings, moving in that same synchronized pattern I'd witnessed at dawn. What the hell are you? I whispered. My recorder picked up a response, not in words, but in sounds, concrete being poured, metal being cut, voices calling measurements, the normal sounds of construction. Except played backward, distorted and wrong. I moved closer to the cold circle, drawn by a morbid fascination I couldn't explain. The thermal image showed the cold figures now arranging themselves in concentric rings around the center point. As I watched, they began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, creating a vortex of cold that made the screen flicker. The air pressure dropped suddenly. My ears popped. The ground beneath my feet vibrated, not like an earthquake, but like something massive shifting far below. Then I saw it, a hand, emerging from the concrete itself. Not breaking through, but phasing through, as if the solid matter offered no resistance. The hand was followed by an arm, a shoulder, the top of a head. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The thermal imager showed the emerging figure as absolute black, no heat signature whatsoever. Mr. Reeves. The voice behind me nearly stopped my heart. I spun around to find Dr. Reed standing there, calm as if she were at a grocery store. You shouldn't be here, she said, her eyes fixed on the emerging figure. Not yet. You don't understand what you're witnessing. Then explain it to me, I demanded, my voice shaking despite my attempt at composure. Time isn't linear, she said simply. Not always. Sometimes it folds back on itself. These aren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They're echoes, moments preserved when time fractured. When what fractured it? Dr. Reed's expression darkened. Come with me, she said. You need to see the archives. As we turned to leave, I glanced back one last time. The figure had emerged completely now, a man in construction clothes, his face a blur of features. He looked directly at me and opened his mouth. What came out wasn't a scream, but its opposite, a sound that pulled rather than pushed, drawing the air from my lungs in a rush that left me gasping. Dr. Reed grabbed my arm and pulled me away. Don't listen, she hissed. That's how it starts. That's how they pull you in. As we hurried to her car, I could still feel the cold circle expanding behind us, reaching for us like hungry fingers. And somewhere in the distance, I heard the first birds begin to sing. Dawn was coming. Dr. Reed drove us through the pre-dawn streets with the precise confidence of someone who knew exactly where traffic cameras were positioned. Her car, an unremarkable gray sedan that somehow managed to avoid drawing attention, hummed quietly as we crossed the Charles River. Where are we going? I asked, still shaking from what I witnessed. Somewhere secure, she replied cryptically. The archives aren't officially sanctioned by any government agency, though several fund us through back channels. We drove to Cambridge, stopping finally at an ordinary office building near MIT. The sign read Institute for Historical Documentation. Dr. Reed used 3 separate key cards and a retinal scan to access the basement. This facility has documented temporal anomalies since 1947, she explained as we descended in an elevator that seemed to go much deeper than a typical basement. Your construction site isn't the first incident in Boston, nor will it be the last. The elevator opened onto a sprawling underground complex. Clinical wide hallways branched in multiple directions, each lined with doors bearing only numbers. Staff in lab coats moved purposefully, barely glancing at us. Dr. Reed led me to a conference room where 3 people already waited. She introduced them tersely: Dr. Marcus Chin, theoretical physicist, Dr. Amara Williams, parapsychologist, and Thomas Blackwood, former military intelligence. Show them, Dr. Reed instructed me. I connected my phone to the room's display system and played the thermal footage. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as everyone watched the cold figures spinning, the form emerging from concrete. Dr. Williams spoke first. Classic temporal echo pattern. But the manifestation is unusually strong. They become self-aware. That's impossible, Dr. Chin countered. Echoes are recordings, not conscious entities. Then explain the security guard, Blackwood interjected, his voice carrying the gravel of decades of cigarettes. Explain why they're organizing in patterns we've never seen before. Dr. Reed turned to me. What you're witnessing, Mr. Reeves, is the aftermath of a temporal fracture. 6 months ago, that construction site was supposed to be the location of a scientific breakthrough, the first successful demonstration of localized time manipulation. Supposed to be? I echoed. In a timeline that no longer exists, she clarified. Something went catastrophically wrong. The experiment not only failed, it erased itself from history. But physics demands conservation of energy. The event that never happened still left an echo. Those figures, I said slowly, they're the scientists? The people who would have been there? Dr. Williams nodded. And the construction workers who died in the accident that never happened, and the bystanders caught in the temporal backlash. All exist now as echoes, trapped in a moment that technically never occurred. They're trying to complete themselves, Blackwood added grimly, to force their way back into reality. I felt sick. And Ron Miller? The security guard? Temporal displacement sickness, Dr. Reed explained. His consciousness partially synchronized with the echo field. He's experiencing time backward. Can you help him? I asked. The four exchanged glances. Potentially, Dr. Reed admitted, but only by stopping what's happening at the site. They showed me the archives then, rooms filled with documentation of similar incidents throughout history. The Roanoke colony disappearance. The Mary Celeste. Dozens of cases where people vanished or were found in catatonic states, all near locations that later showed temporal anomalies. Why show me all this? I finally asked. Why involve a newspaper reporter in something you've clearly been keeping secret for decades? Dr. Reed's expression was unreadable. Because you're already involved, Mr. Reeves. Check your employment records. You didn't start working at the Boston Chronicle 3 weeks ago. You've been there for 3 years. The room spun around me. That's not possible. I moved here from Chicago after my divorce. I started 3 weeks ago. In this timeline, yes, Dr. Williams said gently. But we've been monitoring temporal shift indicators. 3 weeks ago, there was a massive realignment. Records changed. Memories adjusted. Everyone except those of us shielded in this facility experienced the shift without noticing. And you, Blackwood added, you remain partially desynchronized. That's why you can see the echoes when others can't. I struggled to process this. Are you saying I'm from another timeline? We're saying, Dr. Reed clarified, that you were supposed to be at the construction site when the accident happened. In the original timeline, you were one of the journalists invited to document the experiment. You died, Mr. Reeves, Dr. Chen said bluntly. Or rather, a version of you died. And now that echo is trying to pull you back. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. I need to leave. Look at your own evidence, Dr. Reed said calmly. The timestamp on your photo, dawn from the previous day, but taken at night. The thermal image is showing cold where there should be heat. Time is folding at that site, and you're connected to it. I sat back down heavily, my mind racing. If what you're saying is true, what happens if these echoes succeed? If they pull themselves back into reality? Cascading temporal collapse, Dr. Chen explained. The fabric of reality in this region would unravel completely. Massachusetts would cease to exist in any coherent form. So how do we stop it? I asked, surprised at how quickly I accepted their explanation. Perhaps because, deep down, I'd felt that disconnect since I'd arrived in Boston, the sense that I both belonged and didn't belong. We closed the fracture, Blackwood said. But we need someone the echoes will respond to. Someone partially in sync with them. 4 pairs of eyes fixed on me. No, I said. You can't be serious. You're already being drawn there, Dr. Williams pointed out. Every dawn, the connection strengthens. Eventually, you'll be pulled in whether you cooperate or not. But if I help you, I said slowly, what happens to me? The silence that followed was answer enough. We left the archive facility as true dawn broke over Cambridge. The sky was cloudless, promising a beautiful spring day. We drove back toward the construction site in silence, the weight of what I'd learned pressing down on me. As we approached, I felt it, that same pull, stronger now, like a hook behind my sternum drawing me forward. The construction site looked ordinary in daylight, just another urban development stalled by funding issues or permit problems. No one looking at it would imagine the temporal wound festering beneath. Tonight, Dr. Reed said as she stopped a block away, "We'll need you here at midnight. That's when the fracture is most vulnerable." I nodded mutely, still trying to reconcile my memories with what I'd been told. If they were right, my entire life for the past 3 weeks was essentially borrowed time, a glitch in reality's programming. "Get some rest," she advised. "And Mr. Reeves? Don't return to the site alone before tonight. The echoes are growing stronger. They've been waiting for you." As I walked back to my apartment, every step felt somehow wrong, as if my feet didn't quite match the pavement. The city around me seemed slightly transparent, the buildings and people less substantial than they had appeared before. And everywhere I looked, in the corners of my vision, I caught glimpses of shadows moving independently of their sources, reaching, grasping, waiting for their moment to become real again. Waiting for me to help them. I spent the day in a state of unreality. My apartment felt foreign, the furniture, the photos on the walls, the clothes in my closet both mine and not mine. I tried calling my ex-wife in Chicago, but the number was disconnected. When I looked up her social media profiles, they showed her married to someone else for the past 5 years, not 2 years as I remembered. Had my entire life been rewritten? Or was I truly from another timeline, as Dr. Reed suggested? I tried distracting myself with work, reviewing my notes on the East Side development story. That led me down another rabbit hole. The more I researched, the more inconsistencies I found. Articles I had supposedly written but didn't remember writing. Sources I had allegedly interviewed but couldn't recall meeting. By afternoon, my head pounded with the effort of reconciling contradictory memories. I lay down, intending just to rest my eyes, and immediately fell into a deep sleep. The dream came instantly. I stood at the construction site, but it wasn't abandoned. It was complete, a gleaming research facility with Temporal Physics Research Initiative emblazoned across its glass facade. People in lab coats hurried past me, their faces blurred like photographs in motion. None of them noticed me. I walked through the lobby, through security checkpoints, through doors that should have been locked. No one stopped me. It was as if I wasn't really there. The heart of the facility was a massive chamber with a device in its center, a ring of metal and light, humming with power. Scientists monitored screens showing data I couldn't comprehend. Journalists and dignitaries watched from an observation deck. I saw myself among them, camera ready, press badge visible. The other me looked excited, nervous. A countdown began. The device's hum increased to a painful whine. Reality itself seemed to vibrate around it. Then something went wrong. Alarms blared. Scientists shouted instructions that made no sense, references to temporal shear and reality collapse. The ring of light pulsed, expanded, engulfed the room. I watched as everyone, the scientists, the observers, my other self, froze in place, their bodies elongating, stretching like images in a funhouse mirror. Then they shattered, breaking into countless translucent fragments that hung in the air for one terrible moment before imploding. The building collapsed inward, folding into itself like paper being crushed. The world outside darkened as the anomaly spread, consuming everything. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat. The clock read 7:30 p.m. Through my window, the sun was setting, painting Boston in shades of orange and purple. My phone rang. Dr. Reed. It's accelerating, she said without preamble. The fracture is widening faster than we projected. We need to move tonight, as soon as it's fully dark. I saw it, I told her, my voice hoarse. What happened? What was supposed to happen? That's good, she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. Your connection to the event is strengthening. You'll be more effective as our anchor. Anchor to what? Reality, she replied simply. Be ready in 1 hour. They picked me up in an unmarked van. Besides Dr. Reed, Doctors Chen and Williams were there, along with Thomas Blackwood and 2 silent technicians who were setting up equipment I didn't recognize. The plan is relatively straightforward, Dr. Chen explained as we drove. We'll establish a temporal containment field around the fracture site. You'll enter the field and make contact with the echoes. Make contact how? I asked. They're drawn to you, Dr. Williams said. You represent their last connection to reality. When they approach, you'll be wearing this. She handed me what looked like a vest made of translucent material that seemed to shift colors as it moved. Temporal anchor harness, she continued. It'll keep you synchronized with our timeline while you interact with theirs. And then? You persuade them to complete the cycle, Blackwood said. The echoes are stuck in a loop because they're trying to prevent their own destruction. You need to show them it's already happened, that fighting it is what's causing the fracture. So I just tell them they're already dead and they'll, what? Move on? Dr. Reed's expression was grim. In essence, yes. Like convincing a ghost it's no longer alive. And if I can't convince them? The silence that followed was answer enough. We arrived at the construction site at 9:45 p.m. The area had been cordoned off with portable barriers bearing hazard warnings, a convenient fiction that would keep civilians away. The technicians worked quickly, setting up equipment at precise intervals around the foundation pit. Dr. Chen showed me a tablet displaying a 3D model of the site. The fracture is invisible to normal perception, but it's there, a tear in the fabric of space-time approximately 12 feet in diameter, centered here. He pointed to the middle of the pit. As midnight approaches, the temporal distortion will increase, Dr. Williams added. You likely experience disorientation, possibly memory bleed through from your alternate self. They helped me into the anchor harness. It felt unnaturally heavy, as if it existed partly in another dimension. The material hummed against my skin. Remember, Dr. Reed said, gripping my shoulder, whatever you see, whatever they say to you, they aren't real anymore. They're echoes of potentiality, nothing more. I nodded, though a part of me wondered if the same could be said of me. At 11:30, they activated the containment field. A shimmering curtain of what looked like heat distortion surrounded the foundation pit. Inside, the air took on a bluish tinge, thicker somehow, like looking through water. It's time, Blackwood said, checking his watch. Once you're inside, we won't be able to communicate with you. The anchor harness will keep you tethered to our reality for approximately 20 minutes. After that, we pull you out regardless of progress. I took a deep breath and stepped through the containment field. The sensation was indescribable, like walking through a membrane between worlds. Sound dampened instantly. The air felt too dense, pressing against my skin from all directions. Gravity seemed to tug at angles, making each step a conscious effort. The foundation pit no longer looked abandoned. It flickered between states, sometimes empty concrete, sometimes filled with equipment, sometimes a completed structure. Reality wasn't stable here. I moved toward the center, where the fracture was supposedly strongest. The anchor harness grew heavier with each step, its hum increasing to a whine that set my teeth on edge. Then I saw them, the echoes. Not transparent this time, but almost solid. Scientists in lab coats, observers in business attire, security personnel, and they're watching from what would have been an observation deck, my other self. They didn't move naturally. Their motions stuttered, reversed, repeated, like damaged film playing through a faulty projector. Some seemed aware of my presence, their heads turning to follow me with eyes that were just empty voids. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding wrong in the thick air. "I'm here to help." They responded not with words but with a cacophony of sounds played backward, speech in reverse, machines powering down instead of up, the sound of breaking glass reconstructing itself. The other me stepped forward. Unlike the others, his movements were fluid, natural. He looked exactly like me, down to the scar on my right eyebrow from a childhood accident. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "This isn't your time." "It's not yours anymore either," I replied, remembering my purpose. The experiment failed. Everyone here died. He smiled sadly. "We know. But we're still here, aren't we? Caught between moments, between possibilities." "Your echoes," I insisted. "Imprints left on reality when time fractured." "Is that what they told you?" He gestured to the containment field where Dr. Reed and the others waited. "Did they tell you what really happened? Why the experiment failed?" I hesitated. "There was an accident." "No accident," my echo said. "Sabotage." They knew the risks. They knew what would happen if the containment failed. The other figures had drawn closer, forming a circle around us. Their movements were becoming more synchronized, more purposeful. "They're using you," my echo continued. "Just like they used us. Do you really think they care about saving anyone? They want to weaponize temporal manipulation. They caused this fracture deliberately." Doubt crept into my mind. I glanced back at the containment field, at the figures of Dr. Reed and her colleagues, now just silhouettes against the shimmering barrier. "I don't believe you," I said, but my voice wavered. "You don't have to," my echo replied. "You can see for yourself. We can show you what really happened." He extended his hand. The other echoes moved closer, their bodies beginning to blur together like watercolors in rain. The anchor harness grew painfully heavy, the whine now a scream in my ears. Warning indicators flashed on its display, connection destabilizing, temporal sync failing. I had a choice to make. Time slowed to a crawl as I stood facing my echo. His hand remained extended, an invitation to witness truth, or perhaps a trap. The others had formed a perfect circle around us, their bodies now merged into a continuous wall of shifting, translucent forms. The anchor harness burned against my skin, its warning indicators flashing faster. Outside the containment field, I could see Dr. Reed gesturing urgently, her mouth forming words I couldn't hear. I made my decision. Instead of taking my echo's hand, I reached for the harness controls. Dr. Williams had shown me an emergency protocol, a way to reverse the temporal shielding, to broadcast our reality into the fracture rather than shield myself from it. "What are you doing?" My echo's voice sharpened, his form flickering like a failing light bulb. "Ending this," I said, fingers working the complex sequence of buttons. "Not your way, not their way. My way." The harness hummed, its pitch changing from warning to something else, a resonance that made the air vibrate in sympathy. The containment field pulsed, its color shifting from blue to violet. Stop! My echo's form stretched toward me, elongating unnaturally. You don't understand what will happen. But I did understand, at least partly. The fracture existed because these echoes refused to accept their fate, refused to complete the cycle of their existence. They were caught in the moment before destruction, eternally trying to prevent what had already happened in some other timeline. The harness reached full power. A wave of energy pulsed outward from it, washing over the echoes. Their forms wavered, distorted, began to break apart into motes of light. We just wanted to exist, my echo said, his voice now coming from everywhere at once. Is that so wrong? Not wrong, I answered. Just impossible. You can't exist here anymore. The ground beneath us cracked as reality itself protested the convergence of timelines. The foundation pit was transforming, sometimes empty, sometimes filled with equipment, sometimes a gaping void that seemed to lead nowhere. My echo's form was barely recognizable now, just a humanoid shape composed of swirling particles. If we go, you go too, he warned. You're part of us. Part of what never happened. Maybe, I admitted. But that's my choice. The harness reached critical output. The air split with a sound like the universe tearing apart. The echoes, all of them, shattered into countless fragments of light that spun inward, collapsing toward the center of the fracture. I felt myself being pulled along with them, as if gravity itself had shifted its center. The anchor harness, designed to keep me tethered to reality, was failing against the massive temporal current. Through the distortion, I saw Dr. Reed and her team frantically working their equipment. The containment field was collapsing, reality bleeding through in both directions. In that moment of convergence, I saw everything, all possibilities, all timelines. I saw myself dying in the original experiment. I saw myself living a different life in Chicago, never divorced, never a journalist. I saw infinite versions of myself branching out across the multiverse, some happy, some tragic, some barely recognizable as human. The fracture was collapsing, taking me with it. The anchor harness had completely failed, its lights dark, its weight now insubstantial. I was being drawn into the vortex of temporal energy, my body beginning to break apart just like the echoes. Michael. Dr. Reed's voice somehow reached me through the chaos. She had breached the containment field, risking her own existence. Behind her, the others worked frantically to stabilize the collapsing reality. She threw something toward me, a small silver device that tumbled through the distorted air. I caught it instinctively, my fingers closing around cold metal. The failsafe, she shouted. Activated. The device had a single button, recessed to prevent accidental triggering. As my fingers hovered over it, time seemed to freeze completely. In that perfect stillness, my echo reappeared before me, no longer a swirling mass of particles, but clear and defined. He looked tired, resigned. They didn't tell you everything, he said quietly. The failsafe doesn't just close the fracture. It resets the timeline. Resets to what? I asked, though somehow I already knew. To before you came to Boston. Before any of this happened. You'll go back to your life in Chicago. You'll never know any of this occurred. And you? Will be gone, he said simply. Not just hidden or trapped, erased completely. No echoes, no shadows. Just nothing. And the others? I gestured toward Dr. Reed, frozen in mid-motion. The people who died in the original experiment? Still dead, my echo confirmed. This doesn't save them. It just prevents further collapse. I looked down at the failsafe in my hand. Such a small thing to hold such power, the ability to rewrite reality, to erase an entire timeline. There has to be another way, I said. My echo shook his head. There isn't. That's the tragedy of temporal mechanics. Some paradoxes can't be resolved, only contained. The stillness was beginning to break. Cracks appeared in the air itself, reality fragmenting as the fracture destabilized further. I don't want to forget, I said, surprised by how much I meant it. Despite the horror, despite the danger, these 3 weeks in Boston felt more real than my entire life before. You won't, entirely, my echo said. Dreams, déjà vu, moments of insight, parts of this will echo in your subconscious. Just as we echoed here. The fracture was widening exponentially now. Beyond Dr. Reed, I could see Cambridge beginning to distort, buildings twisting into impossible shapes as temporal chaos spread. I pressed the button. Light exploded outward, a silent nova that consumed everything, the construction site, the city, the echoes, myself. I felt my body dissolve, my consciousness expanding then contracting in an instant. Then darkness. I woke to the sound of my alarm clock. 6:30 a.m., Chicago, my apartment. The divorce papers still sat inside on my coffee table. My job at the Tribune waited for me, same as always. Everything was as it had been 3 weeks ago, before I made the decision to move to Boston. No memories of temporal fractures or echoes or Dr. Reed and her team. Just the vague sense that I'd been having an intense dream, already fading as consciousness reasserted itself. I showered, dressed, went to work. Life continued exactly as it had before. Except for the dreams. Each dawn, as I hovered between sleep and wakefulness, I saw them, silhouettes against the morning light, their forms rippling like heat mirages. They never spoke, never moved toward me. Just watched, as if waiting for me to remember something important. And sometimes, walking downtown, I'd catch glimpses of a woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She would nod to me once, then disappear into the crowd before I could approach her. 6 months later, I received a job offer from the Boston Chronicle. The editor, a man named Blake, claimed to have admired my work for years. The position came with a substantial raise and a corner office overlooking the eastern suburbs. I declined. Something about Boston filled me with inexplicable dread, as if the city itself were waiting for me, hungry for something I couldn't name. Instead, I requested assignment to our paper's science desk. My first major story covered advancements in theoretical physics, specifically research into the nature of time. During my research, I found myself drawn to obscure academic papers on temporal echo phenomena and reality conservation principles. Most scientists dismiss these concepts as fringe physics, but they resonated with me on some fundamental level I couldn't explain. One night, working late, I discovered a reference to an Institute for Historical Documentation based in Cambridge. Their website was minimal, offering little information beyond an address and a contact email. On impulse, I sent a query about their research. The response came at dawn the next morning. Mr. Reeves, some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten. Some choices, once made, echo across all possible timelines. The shadows are still waiting. Yar. I deleted the email immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely operate the mouse. That day, I withdrew my application to the science desk and requested transfer to sports coverage instead. Sometimes, the only way to stop an echo is to stop listening for it. But every dawn, I still check the eastern horizon. And sometimes, just for a moment, I see them, silhouettes against the morning light, their forms rippling like heat mirages. Waiting. Remembering. Echoing across a timeline that never was, but somehow still exists in the shadows between moments. In the shadows at dawn. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.